Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to Toronto. I'm Landon Darrence. I'm Vice President of Energy and Infrastructure at the Atlantic Council, where I have the pleasure to lead the Global Energy Center. And building on an opportunity that we had last year in Torino with G7, we're extremely excited to welcome you to the Summit on the Future of Energy Security, a partnership that we have with Natural Resources Canada and the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. A year ago, we decided that we should have a presence at the G7 Energy Ministerial because it is a location where we can have shared impact. And the benchmarks and the agreement and alignment that we can design around the G7 becomes a baseline for freedom and prosperity around the world. But why think about energy security? Well, as many people can recognize, the world is thinking through what it means to be energy secure today. And it is a multifaceted topic anchored in national security, economic opportunity, political stability. And I think that means that it varies and it's distinct across regions. And so as we bring this multinational group together of like-minded countries, we want to explore these issues and find solidarity where we can to keep moving forward shared priorities. As I look around the world, I think I see a variation in terms of how countries and companies and others are addressing energy security in their specific lens of how they operate. And the United States, of course, we've moved from a moment of resource scarcity. You go back to 2005, we were importing 12 million barrels a day. The U.S. government today, I know the Department of Energy is here. Secretary Chris Wright's on his way to the ministerial tomorrow. And obviously, we're thinking about a very different lens of resource abundance, of comparative abundance, of energy dominance. Europe and Asia, on the other hand, still dealing with resource scarcity in many occasions, thinking for a greater push on diversification, a pursuit of indigenous resources, renewable energies, nuclear energy. How do we do that and alleviate the pressures of reliance on untrustworthy partners? The Middle East, you have a perspective, especially in the Arab Gulf, of a sustained demand, a need for a sustained demand for petroleum products, because that is a backstop for revenues. It's a backstop for the opportunity to actually diversify economies. And of course, I would be surprised if it doesn't come up today, but China, looking at the ecosystem of energy for the future, using tech supremacy, control of materials, manufacturing as a pressure point to be a counterbalance to the community that's coming together here in Toronto. So we're excited to explore these issues and have a conversation on the summit of the future of energy security because it is dynamic. I think there's a diversity of views, and you're going to hear from experts from industry, from government, from elsewhere today about these issues. For those online, we're also equally excited to have you here. It will be a vibrant conversation for the next 3 hours, but to have initial impact, we're really excited to invite from Natural Resources Canada, the Senior Assistant Deputy Minister for Land and Minerals Sector, and the Special Envoy for Critical Minerals Production Alliance, Isabella Chan, to the stage to provide some welcoming remarks. Isabella, welcome.
Good morning. Thank you so much to the Atlantic Council for having me here today. Acknowledge the land we're meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wada peoples, and it is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. As a Canadian, I thank the Indigenous peoples as stewards of our land for their traditional knowledge, cultures, and enduring contributions. It is an honor to stand before you today at the 2025 Summit of the Future of Energy Security. And as Landon noted, I'm Isabella Chan, Senior Assistant Deputy Minister of Lands and Minerals Sector and Natural Resources Canada. And I also have the special privilege of serving as Canada's Critical Minerals Production Alliance Envoy. And I've been working very busily with my Envoy colleagues, a network of colleagues in all G7 countries. On behalf of Minister Hodgson, who will be joining us later today, I would like to extend a special acknowledgement to the distinguished leaders joining us in the audience here today. Your presence and leadership in shaping energy policies and securing our shaped global future is deeply appreciated. Canadians, we value collaboration and partnership. There's no place more symbolic of this spirit than the G7, which originated in 1975 to address economic concerns from the oil crisis and the collapse of the Bretton Woods system. And today, we unite with optimism and shared resolve at a pivotal moment, a moment where our collective action can help reshape our shared future. In the midst of global uncertainty, including a rapidly changing global trade landscape and concentrated markets and supply chains, we are driven by a common purpose: defending our economic and national security in ways that result in both resiliency and prosperities across our societies. One core pillar of our journey lies in the strategic development of critical minerals, which underpin our national defense, our economic resiliency, and the energy transition, all of which are essential to power the modern economy and contribute to a more secure future. Canada proudly stands at the forefront of this transformation, given our abundance in mineral resources. We have over 75 operational critical minerals mines and processing facilities, alongside approximately 170 advanced stage projects, over half of them with the potential to be operational in the near to immediate term. This robust pipeline of projects not only fuels Canada's domestic industrial base, but also positions us as a trusted and responsible global supplier of choice. As we navigate the complexities of today's world, addressing supply chain resiliency requires more than securing physical assets. We must think creatively and employ novel tools. Around the world, non-market policies and practices are reshaping global markets and intensifying competition for critical minerals, including what we hear on the news all the time now, rare earth elements. In response, we must foster transparent, secure, and non-concentrated critical mineral supply chains that grow our industries and protect our national interests, while strengthening partnerships with Canada's international allies. We must do so through pragmatic and targeted investments, efficient and timely permitting, and use of tools such as stockpiling and price floors, amongst others. Our commitment to global collaboration is already showing results. Under our G7 presidency, Canada and our allies announced the Critical Minerals Action Plan and welcome the Critical Minerals Production Alliance. These initiatives are designed to drive offtakes, co-investments, and innovation necessary to unlock additional supplies of critical minerals. Together with our like-minded allies, we are advancing a proactive approach that will transform supply chain challenges into opportunities for shared progress. To put this into action, Canada signed a joint declaration of intent to deepen critical minerals cooperation with Germany in August, and we are conducting a strategic mapping exercise with the UK to identify critical minerals projects for joint investment. We are also working very closely with our European Union allies on our strategic partnership on raw materials, as well as trade and investment activities with Italy and France under our respective critical minerals instruments. Recently, I traveled to Japan and held the second Japan-Canada Battery Supply Chain Dialogue to build sustainable and reliable global battery supply chains. And Canada continues to work with our G7 Production Alliance envoys, including the US, to advance mutual interests. And this year, Canada passed the Building Canada Act and established a major project office, setting the stage for more critical mineral projects to reach final investment decisions within a 2-year window in regions from coast to coast to coast. We're ensuring not only our economic competitiveness, but also position ourselves as a trusted supplier to our global partners as we diversify our supply chain. We meet today's challenge with a spirit of unity and collaboration that is as profound as it is necessary. Our approach envisions critical mineral supply chains that are resilient, grounded in high standards and innovation. As we move forward with specific actions and commitments at the G7 Energy and Environment Ministerial, details that build on our Critical Minerals Protection Alliance and Action Plan, we are laser focused on turning ambition into tangible actions. As we stand on this threshold and prepare to transition the G7 presidency to our friends in France, there is an undeniable motivation and focus on action. Our work reaffirms Canada's role as a secure, responsible, and reliable source of critical minerals required to bolster defenses, power the digital economy, and fuel the energy transition. We're paving a path that not only promises stronger supply chains and better economic opportunities, but also brings us closer to a future that sees Canada and our allies both prosperous and resilient. And with that, let me turn it back to Landon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Senior Assistant Deputy Minister Chan. Great remarks, and I think on a fairly dynamic area of growth, reflecting new energies and the complexity of the energy system going forward. A soft pivot here in terms of real energy security as well. We have an opportunity, not in person, but His Excellency Roman Andrach, who's the Deputy Minister of Ukraine, has presented us with some remarks that he's recorded from Kiev, where we've watched Russia's sustained bombardment of energy infrastructure degrade 50% of that nation's energy infrastructure. And that's leading to its own transformations. You're watching distributed energy systems and new technologies like the storage and batteries that we just heard about becoming more powerful and more important to our collective energy security. So we thought from the Atlantic Council's perspective, there would be no better voice than to introduce those issues into the dialogue today. So please join me as we listen to the minister's remarks.
Dear colleagues, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to address the participants of the Summit of the Future of the Energy Security organized by our trusted and long-standing partner, the Atlantic Council. It is my pleasure to have the opportunity to address you about our Ukrainian experience and lessons learned on the extremely important issue of the strengthening energy security. Each large-scale attack by the Russian Federation involves hundreds of missiles and drones, intentionally targeting thermal and hydropower plants, gas production, transmission systems. In October alone, nearly 4 gigawatts of generation were damaged. More than gigawatts had been restored by our energy workers, and almost 3 gigawatts remain offline. 1/3 of gas production is destroyed. Strikes intended to disrupt the energy system over the winter. Our reply to those challenges: solidarity and cooperation. Our priorities for the next heating season include energy infrastructure protection and resilience. This includes active defense, passive protection, and ensuring power balance and repair campaign. We are making every effort to respond quickly to attacks. Natural gas supply. Due to the losses in gas production, we have to import more gas than planned. Energy system decentralization and modernization. We develop distributed generation, changing the architecture of our energy system in response to attacks. This is being carried out by our energy companies, heroic work of energy workers, regional utilities, and private investors, with financing provided both by international partners and from our company's own funds. Our priorities are based on the experience gained and the following lessons learned during the war period. First of all, resilience is key. We leverage the large number of alternatives of the energy sources supply chain, stop being dependent on the terrorist state. Large centralized power plants are easy targets. Distributed generation, solar panels, wind turbines, biogas plants spread across regions is much harder to destroy. Resilience also means community-based solutions, microgrids for hospitals, schools, and municipalities, supported by energy efficiency measures in homes, backup generators, charging stations, mobile modular plants. Ensuring energy storage is crucial. Batteries, hydroelectric power plants. Modernizing and decarbonizing the energy sector in line with EU targets is an absolute priority despite ongoing challenges. We are rapidly expanding renewable energy sources, solar, wind, bioenergy. Aligning with Europe's strategic objectives and standards on the policy side, we are committed to fully transpose EU legislative frameworks into our energy sector. We want to ensure our regulatory environment aligned with EU directives and sustainability commitments. We bet on innovations, large and small modular reactors, and the digitalization of smart grids to enhance resilience and operational efficiency. We are also strengthening cybersecurity measures. Dear colleagues, I would like to emphasize that Ukraine aims to address the energy trilemma, ensuring energy security, affordability, and sustainability despite ongoing hostilities. Accelerating and modernization of decarbonization of Ukraine's energy infrastructure, particularly in nuclear, renewables, and smart grids, is a top priority of our efforts. And of course, I would like to express my deep gratitude to all our international partners for supporting Ukraine and our energy sector in these difficult times. Thank you. Stand with Ukraine.
Have you all, have the panel take their seats? Great. Morning, everyone. I'm David Goldwyn. I'm chairman of the Atlantic Council's Energy Advisory Group. We're really delighted to have this panel here today. There's really no better place to talk about energy security if you're an American than Canada. We have a $151 billion trade relationship. We take a lot of oil, gas, and electricity. We send a little bit of electricity, gas, and oil in the other direction. In hurricane season, knowing that we get oil security by pipeline rather than by sea as a source of security. And people can forget, but when the minister talks about resilience, that ability to move back and forth, to be able to adapt to circumstances, to be able to deal with geographic differences, that's what energy security is. And everybody has their own definition of energy security. Mine is the supply of reliable, affordable, sustainable energy free of coercion, which is what you have in Ukraine. And that's what we have. And so this morning, we really got a terrific panel, to talk about energy security, not only in this area, but how you're doing energy security worldwide. So we've got every sector represented. So we've got Kendall Dilling, who is president of Pathways Alliance. That's the oil sands, essentially agglomeration. John Gorman from Westinghouse Canada is going to talk to us about nuclear, but hopefully nuclear worldwide. My old friend Pete Sheffield from Enbridge, midstream and a little bit of gas. And then the esteemed Halima Croft, our board member and managing director and head of commodity strategy and MENA research at RBC Capital Markets, known to all of you, to talk about geopolitics. I'll have her last in the order. And we'll talk a little bit of what's going on in the world right now with Russia and Venezuela and other places and how that will help, harm, or otherwise disrupt energy security. So we're going to jump right in. And I think, John, we're going to start with you and nuclear. A lot of news about nuclear. The new in the U.S. at least, nuclear is chic again. There's bipartisan support for it. Some of its plant life extension. There's a lot of enthusiasm about SMRs. Your big news yesterday, $80 billion U.S. investment for big nuclear. So I guess if you can take us a little bit of, in the next 5 years, both in North America and other places, what are we going to see in the nuclear industry, not just from Westinghouse, but what is this really about? How fast and what kind of nuclear are we going to see? And then I'm going to come back to all of you to ask you what the G7 can do to help your businesses work better. But start us off, John.
Thank you. Thanks, David. And it's a real pleasure to be here with all of you today. Thanks to the organizers. David, I think the next 5 years are going to be a continuation of a very aggressive reemergence of nuclear as a central source of energy for the world. So I'll address that in a minute, just to for everyone's awareness. So I am John Gorman, president of Westinghouse Canada. We are 100% Canadian owned by Cameco, the world's second largest uranium exporter in the world. We sit on the best uranium, most pure uranium resources in Saskatchewan. Very fortunate position for us. And our other owner, Brookfield, which is, of course, one of the largest alternative asset managers in the world. And I think when it comes to nuclear, they're probably the top one. David, to address what happened yesterday, because it's going to be relevant to my prediction here for the next 5 years, there was an announcement yesterday that Brookfield, who was driving this, had entered into an agreement with the United States government to invest $80 billion in the rollout of large nuclear Westinghouse reactors. 10 units of which they would like to see a shovel in the ground by 2030. So significant movement, certainly by the end of this administration. That's significant, right? You can't, having the United States step forward and present a very aggressive time schedule for the rollout of nuclear to support data centers and other needs is going to add to the very significant momentum we have globally here for nuclear. And when I think about the next 5 years, I think about the past 5 years. And I want to point out to all of you that 5 years ago, in the Canadian context, but I think this applies globally, we could not find a federal decision maker, minister, to say the word nuclear behind a microphone, right? And what we have today in Canada is our significant plans for the rollout of large and small nuclear. It's happening now. Ontario is the G7 leader, the G7 leader anyway, in terms of rolling out the first small modular reactors at Darlington in Ontario. The Ontario Energy Plan calls for an additional 15 gigawatts. That would be about 12 Westinghouse reactors being built out over the next short number of years. That is a very significant amount of nuclear, no matter how you look at it. Canada is a real market and a leader and regarded as such on the world stage. We see similar, different plans, but real pathways in New Brunswick, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. So all this to say that this momentum we've seen over the last 5 years has now been given a turbocharge by activity in the United States. And we're going to see this real engagement between the OECD countries and China and Russia in terms of that race for energy dominance in the nuclear space for all sorts of reasons that I think we're going to be discussing in a broader context. And Canada has the opportunity now to be central to that, not only by virtue of its ownership of Westinghouse and the coordination and the de-risking, the sharing of best practices, the coordination of workforce and supply chain that we can have between US and Canada, but because we also have a great deal of pedigree in nuclear, including great experience on the can-do side of things. The demand is so great, we're going to require everything. And I would just encourage all of you to think about the fact that this can't just be a Canada play where we're thinking about how we're going to benefit from our own nuclear deployment. This is our opportunity to collaborate with G7 nations like the United States and be able to deploy nuclear around the world and bring energy security to everyone.
Great answer. Thank you. Let me ask you one hard question as a follow-up. Cost and supply chain. So at least in the US, big nuclear has had serious cost issues, and some of that has to do with the supply chain. Some of it has to do with how few large nuclear plants were built in the US. There's been some talk in the paper about government could really support the nuclear industry if it would provide some sort of assurance against cost overruns going forward, that you sort of need that extra investor security because of the past. Talk to me just quickly about sort of how you see the outlook for cost management and for supply chain management for this next phase.
Yeah, thanks, David. I'd say two things. One is we have a lot to learn from China, and we should be watching them closely. We may get into how China has spent the last 20 years, advancing for a new economy, both in critical minerals and energy that applies to nuclear. They're currently building out 30 large nuclear plants, and they're doing it now in sub-5-year build-out periods. And at half the cost that's been able to be achieved anywhere on Earth. And David, to your point, it's because they're taking a rinse, lather, repeat type of approach. They also have, the ability to do state-backed financing and, completely different construct from what the way that we approach things here. But I would just say, sort of succinctly, with the new build and trying to avoid the cost and time overruns of our past experience, we have to make sure that we're building out multiple units, which we now have the pathway to do, both in the United States and in Canada as examples. And it's true, we're going to have to do a massive sort of OECD supply chain revamp, because no existing supply chain, whether in Canada, where we've got a very strong group of supply chain people, or in the United States, or even in our partners, are going to be able to handle the massive amount of build out that we've got going here in this momentum.
Great, thanks. Pete, let me turn to you next. A lot of enthusiasm about gas demand, data centers. I think it's supposed to be 6% of U.S. demand, but so I wonder if you can talk to us a little bit about how you see the outlook for gas demand and what Enbridge and others are doing. Are you expecting a huge increase, or are you just doing project execution right now? And in terms of building new stuff, there's been a lot of positive talk about permitting. Speed of permitting in the U.S. and in Canada. How much of that is just talk, and how much of that are you seeing real material changes on the ground yet?
Okay. Let's see if can you hear me?
You're on.
Okay. Thanks, David. Appreciate the Atlantic Council hosting this event with Natural Resources Canada and the Munk School. I think it's certainly timely and great to see the conversation happening alongside the G7 ministerial. I thought I might be the first person to mention AI and data centers 25 minutes into this discussion, but David beat me to it. So as David mentioned, I represent Enbridge, and I'll give folks just a quick overview of our business and how it informs the perspective that I'll offer. So if you live here in Toronto, or if you're based in Ontario, we're your gas company, right? So we operate the gas distribution network, gas utility here in Ontario and Quebec. Also have utilities dotted across the United States. So 1 in 12 gas customers in North America is an Enbridge customer. That informs our thinking around gas demand and the movement of the molecule. We also operate a large gas transmission and storage business. So roughly 25% of the natural gas that's consumed in and through North America on any given day moves along our system. We operate a liquids pipeline network. Much of that oil that David described supporting U.S. refineries from Canada into the U.S., PADD 2 and PADD 3 moves through our mainline system. We're also investing in egress for Permian production. We operate the largest crude oil export facility outside of Corpus Christi. And we have a power business that operates and develops power projects onshore in the US and Canada, and then offshore in Europe. So that's a bit of an overview of how we think about energy and the movement of energy. We're in the infrastructure business, and so we have to have an understanding of the fundamentals, how that's changing. Sort of AI factors into that for sure. But we're making large capital-intensive investments in long-lived assets. So we take a pretty long view. So specific to your question, so we see a lot of opportunity across all 4 of those lines of business in and out of North America. Our capital expansion program right now, so outlook over the next 3 years, we are investing $32 billion in expansion projects. Roughly 72% of that is tied to the movement of natural gas. If you look out further, the next 5 years, we've got another $50 billion of opportunities that we're pursuing. Again, we see opportunities and are are moving quick to turn those opportunities into secured capital projects across all four of those business, but just specific to natural gas, and then I'll try to hit on permitting, but recognizing this is a lightning round that may be for the break. Where we're investing in gas, so part of it is maintaining and enhancing the existing network. So we operate just in the distribution system. You know, I think I heard yesterday internally we were talking about how expansive that network is. It would wrap around the globe 4.5 times. We also operate 70,000 miles of natural gas transmission systems throughout North America. So maintaining, upgrading, modernizing that system, figuring out how we can drive efficiencies for existing utility customers, for industrial demand, before you start to talk about data centers, and then for the power sector, there's lots of opportunities. But what's driving a lot of that growth, we're connected to every one of the LNG export facilities that operates along the Gulf Coast in the US. We are connected to and exploring opportunities along the west coast of Canada to continue to build out. That opportunity is the second wave of LNG exports out of North America, and to support demand among our G7 partners and other nations to support energy requirements globally today and tomorrow. And then on the data center side, yeah, you said 6%. Somebody else would say 15%. You know, I think what seems to be very real is, I think, just, you know, among some of I think the 5 largest players in terms of their infrastructure investment committed to energy for data centers and AI in the US alone in 2025, that number is close to $400 billion. So, you know, there's a lot of infrastructure opportunity around that. I think there are a lot of challenges and policy questions, market design questions that are yet to be sorted out to ensure that that doesn't have a debilitating impact on sort of those 3 considerations of energy security, affordability, and sustainability. But there's lots of opportunities for gas throughout North America. I think also, as we think about kind of the next tranche of growth, even in our distribution business here in Ontario, the discussion earlier around critical minerals and the mining opportunities also is quite inviting in terms of what we can provide and offer for a fit for service solution to provide natural gas to support and sustain that growth opportunity. Permitting quickly.
Yeah.
I do think, you know, we are in a moment where there's sort of this sobriety around the need to build things, the opportunity to leverage, from a North American perspective, the natural resources on offer, and to further integrate our economies, but also in a Canadian context, potentially to gain more market access to other global partners. And that's really encouraging. I think we've seen a lot of early positive signals from a North American context, certainly in the US, a focus on efficiency, clarity around permitting decisions, and some early positive signals in Canada as well. This government moved very quickly to enact Bill C-5 to rationalize and bring a bit of structure to what needs to be, from our perspective, you know, a very transparent, predictable, and efficient process to attract capital and the necessary investment. There's more that needs to happen, and a big question for project developers, those who are financing projects, and the entire value chain is, you know, what's the durability of these policy decisions? I'm mindful of John's comments about what was verboten 5 years ago in terms of even mentioning certain types of energy. We need to continue to invest in energy systems, and that requires a durable policy signal to attract capital. And we're moving in the right direction, but more work needs to be done.
Well, it sounds like you've got a wish list. I'll come back to everybody with their wish list in a lightning round, but let me move to Kendall Dilling and Pathways Alliance next. There's been a lot of good news and some bad news in the oil patch. A lot of growth from the Canadian oil sands sector over the last 5 years, but we're looking at $60 WTI, and President Trump would like to drive that even lower for reasons which are baffling the U.S. oil patch, I think, a little bit. But so I'm curious about two things. One is, what is the outlook, I think, both in terms of production growth and infrastructure for Canada? And given the atmosphere that we're working in right now, how much is Canada looking abroad, to other countries outside the U.S. for future markets?
Yeah, thank you, David. Thank you to the Atlantic Council, Monk School, and Arcan for this hosting us today. So we've talked a bit about nuclear, natural gas. We'll kind of round it out here with the oil story. I think similarly, for the last decade, probably you didn't say the word oil in polite company. That's definitely changed now. I think we're into an era of more pragmatism about the realities of global energy needs and geopolitical security and all those kinds of factors, purely from a market perspective. The outlook is strong for oil, and I'll say particularly heavy oil, which is what we produce in the oil sands. Non-industry people don't usually distinguish between types of oil, but even though the peak oil and the demise of oil has been being called for a long time, typically people are thinking about light oil in that context, which is your primary feedstock for gasoline. And everyone's got their own crystal ball on timelines, but at some point, with EV penetration, you would expect to see that market kind of peak. And, our forecast would suggest that even, in terms of North American demand, we do expect that to peak at some point in the future. But heavy oil is a different market, and it's a preferred feedstock for things like diesel and jet fuel and petrochemical products. And those are much longer term and resilient markets, both in North America and outside. And the oil sands barrel is particularly well suited for those markets. And, when you look, there's just a certain reality that's very germane to the G7 conversation in terms of where the big sources of heavy oil are in the world, who could meaningfully step up and meet that global demand. Certainly the Canadian oil sands is one. The others would be, Russia, Venezuela, Middle East. And so, in this audience, I don't need to talk about the implications of that. And so I think, in a North American context, the U.S. Gulf Coast is, starting to run short of heavy. Mexico's production has fallen off a cliff. Venezuela's always got challenges. So, there's clearly demand in that market. And then to your question, and now that we've got TMX off the west coast of Canada, we've been, testing markets around the world, particularly in Asia. And it's incredible, actually. And in Asia, there's a lot of what we call complex refineries, which are really refineries / petrochemical facilities. And as we've got our first cargoes of Canadian heavy into those facilities, they love it and are hungry for more. It is a great feedstock for those complex refineries. So bottom line, David, is, I think there's a lot of global demand, and we expect that to be long-lived. And, obviously think Canada is very well suited, not only in terms of the quality of our resource, but even from a geopolitical perspective in terms of working with allies. We think we would be a preferred supplier of oil in that scenario.
Let me ask you a little bit about emissions. I know there's been a lot of work over the last couple of decades, frankly, in the oil sands about reducing the emissions profile and, sort of global tolerances shift. But where is the sector right now on emissions, and how do you all compare yourselves to other benchmarks? And is there anything coming that you want to talk about?
Yeah, thanks, David. I think that's really important that not get lost in the conversation that we're having today, more around urgency of and need for energy strategically. The environmental lens remains very, very critical. When I first started in this role several years ago, I had to constantly defend why we would invest in decarbonizing oil production, because there was a view that oil was going to be, gone in a decade or whatever. And why would you make that investment? Now I'm making the same arguments, but to a different question, which is, why would you invest in emissions abatement? Because nobody cares anymore. And we really don't hold that view. Our thesis remains that this is a long-lived industry. And even though right now maybe there's been globally a bit of a pullback on the climate agenda, oil sands is everything we do, we think long-term. If we were to start today to develop a brand new greenfield oil sands development, that's probably a decade out. And then you expect that to be a 20, 30, 40-year project. So we're thinking in decades. And we know that over the long term, to be competitive, to access global markets, you're going to have to compete on both cost and carbon. And we've been quietly doing great work in the oil sands. In fact, just this week, it's very timely, S&P Global came up with their 2024 update on oil sands emissions. And we're now at 57 kilograms a barrel. That's 23% decrease over the last decade and a bit. And frankly, are very competitive right now on a carbon intensity basis with any heavy crude stream in the world. And we have still great ambitions with carbon capture and storage and these other projects that we continue to invest and advance in. So again, in the long term, we think we can compete on cost, and we believe we'll have to compete on carbon or we will eventually get squeezed out of markets.
Great, thank you. Leeman, let me turn to you. A lot of enthusiasm about, potential supply and potential demand, and sometimes the world cooperates and sometimes the world intervenes. So there's so much going on right now, sort of an expectation of an oil price overhang, but the potential of a disruption because of Russia sanctions or military action in Venezuela. So can you give us a little tour d'horizon, sort of where is this market going? Where do you expect significant changes or disruptions?
Well, first of all, I want to thank Natural Resources Canada, the Mung School for hosting us, and Landon for doing such an exceptional job with the Center at the Atlantic Council, like bar none, the best energy research center in the world. David, we have been talking about these issues for like 20 years. Like I met you 20 years ago on a task force on energy and national security. And we were discussing on that task force report, like how much to talk about sort of Russia's pullback from what we thought was a trajectory to being a more open country when they were part of the G8 to get to where we actually are sitting right now. Actually, Venezuela was starting its decline as well. We had Hugo Chavez in power when we wrote that report. Now we're talking about, is there sort of an end to this sort of revolutionary moment in Venezuela? Are we talking about regime change? What would that mean for investment? When it comes to Russia sanctions, we had this conversation last night. I actually think the sanctions on paper are meaningful. People who say Russia's been managed to evade sanctions since the invasion of Ukraine, I would say we never seriously sanctioned Russian energy. There was a reason why we never imposed blocking sanctions on Rosneft, on Lukoil at the start of the war, is because we wanted to keep Russian oil on the market. Every sanction we did initially, when we sanctioned the G20, the central bank, the first time we sanctioned a G20 central bank, when we sanctioned the major Russian financial institutions, we carved out energy. And when the Europeans went forward with the sixth package of sanctions and banned the import of Russian seaborne oil into Europe, but more importantly, had this services ban, essentially saying no European service provider can move Russian barrels to third markets, that's why we did price caps. We did price caps to ensure that those barrels would move to India. It was essentially designed to prevent inflation from a major disruption of Russian oil. Yes, we wanted it to be at a lower price, but I would argue the primacy of price caps was to keep Russian oil on the market. If we thought that these were useless measures, virtue signaling measures, we would have done them initially. So I do think on paper, essentially saying to a refinery like Reliance that you no longer can have your 500,000 barrel a day agreement with Rosneft, or you can lose access to US capital markets, on paper, that is material. If you are Çırpas in Turkey, and again, it's your choice. Do you want to access US regulated financial institutions or take Rosneft and Lukoil barrels? I think the choice will be, I want to still deal with US regulated financial institutions if we enforce it. If we enforce it, I think these sanctions are material. Yes, independent Chinese teapot refineries will not be part of this mix because they are not part of this sort of global financial order. But Sinopec is. And so I do think that you could see if we're talking about, is it 1 million barrels potentially of Russian crude that is struggling to find a home, 1.5 million if we enforce it. Yes, again, it all comes down to enforcement. And the reason I think they went forward with this really harkens back to our keynote speaker, talking about what Russia has been able to do to Ukraine. Russia, because they have a massive manpower advantage, the Atlantic Council's talked a lot about this. They have the financial wherewithal because they've been able to continue to sell their natural resources to pay people to enlist. They are basically paying, by some estimates, they're getting 1,000 people a day to enlist in the Russian army. They do not have to do mass mobilization. Ukraine does. And so that means that Russia is not losing. We may be in sort of a stalemate, but they're not losing the conflict. And when you listen to military experts that have been brought into the Council on Foreign Relations, some of the, forecasting they talk about by, 12 months from now, if you don't cut off the Russian war ATM, are pretty dismal in terms of what Russia can take a year from now. Can they get all of Donetsk and Luhansk at a cost of 50,000 soldiers? Possibly. We've heard some military experts talking about them moving as far as the Dnieper River in 12 months' time. So the question is, do you want to go down that path? Or do you want to try to curb the flow of funds that are enabling this war dynamic to continue? So I think that is the choice facing a Trump administration. I've heard senior Trump administration officials express new resolve to try to be serious about sanctions enforcement, also growing off of the dark fleet, those type of measures. Time will tell. I think the market is skeptical because I think the market believes that price caps, again, were designed to sanction Russia, not to enable Russian barrels on the market. So I think there's a lot of market skepticism. Also, they see Iranian barrels on the market and say, you know what, you're not really taking Iranian barrels off the market. Again, I would say that we made a choice to go soft on sanctions enforcement on Iran, again, because we wanted a well-supplied market. Again, that does not mean you can take every barrel off the market. Barrels do find their way around. But again, if you rigorously enforce it, it doesn't mean that the impact is minimal. And then we get to a situation like Venezuela. And I think Venezuela, if we did have some type of change in power in Venezuela, I actually think the market might initially think that this is very bullish for oil. They'll think that, very bearish for oil initially, that essentially bullish for companies, that essentially like a light switch will remove all sanctions. Western companies will be able to go back in and we'll be talking about the renaissance of the Venezuelan oil sector. I would just say that, as you know, David, you know Venezuela so well, it will be a long road back for Venezuela. We've been talking about the crisis in Venezuela for 20 years. This has not been a 12-month crisis. And so encouraging people to return to Venezuela, rebuilding infrastructure in Venezuela. People talk about the need to get small arms out of circulation in Venezuela. It has human development indicators, a country like a conflict situation. So the question is who's going to invest? The debt restructuring of Venezuela, extremely complicated endeavor. Someone's going to have to lead on this and pay for this. But I think there'll be some initial optimism. But the other thing I'll say, and I know we don't have much time, is I think the foreign policy angle of Venezuela is going to be fascinating as well, because who's operating in Venezuela? Rosneft is operating in Venezuela. You go to the PDVSA towers, they have significant number of floors in the PDVSA towers. China has been a major lender to Venezuela. So it's going to be a very interesting turn of power situation in terms of, does Russia and China, do they want to give up that satellite in our hemisphere?
Let me quickly come back. That was terrific. Let me quickly come back to you on China because, you said if sanctions are enforced, could be 1 million barrels. But it seems to me that really the fulcrum of U.S. policy towards Russia isn't Russia and isn't Ukraine. It's China, which is, we threaten secondary sanctions for people who import Venezuelan oil. Chinese are getting it at a $30 discount. Threatened India about importing Russian oil, but there's no mention of Russian oil in the U.S.-China talks. So we're kind of making China great again with all these discounted oil supplies. So do you think that the Trump administration is ready to enforce these kind of sanctions against China? And if not, is Chinese demand going to be
Or,
continuing to drive the
David,
market.
is this the art of the deal? So I think it's an interesting conversation when we talk about like trade negotiations. How much this administration has put US energy at the center of trade negotiations. And so is there the sort of possible, when we talk about a potential US-China deal, what is the energy component of that? Is there like a conversation about we want a reduction in Russian imports for X in return for, US supplying into that market? Certainly, we've seen it with the European negotiations, energy at the forefront of that. As we go into talks with India, again, we expect US energy to be part of the negotiations. And so I do wonder, is the part of the formula that they're thinking about when it comes to Russia in the negotiations is obviously you're not taking Russia to zero, but is there scope for US barrels to potentially back out or play a role in backing out in some of these countries? Again, it's not going to be a perfect one for one. There's going to be conversations about how much additional you can get from countries like Saudi Arabia. But the last thing I'll say is that we're in a low price environment right now because there's the narrative of like, oil on the water, the glut is coming. But if you did have, again, like a enforcement mechanism on these sanctions. And again, I do think for some of these companies as well, just the like language on this is going to force compliance departments to be like, I don't really want to deal with this right now. So I do think we're going to start to see companies backing away. But if there's a significant $1 million to $1.5 million, if we turn to the Saudis, the problem is OPEC has been putting barrels on the market. President Trump has been like successful in getting more out of OPEC. But the problem is the more you get out of OPEC, the less there's left if there is a problem.
Great, thanks. Well, we've got about 3 minutes left, 2.5. So I want to do a lightning round with the remaining panelists. We're here on the margins of the G7, the Atlantic Council. The thing we like to do best is give gratuitous policy advice to policymakers and tell them how to do their jobs. So, to put this diplomatically, because you all represent companies, what is one or two things which you think governments, G7 governments, the US, the Canadian government could do that would help accelerate and drive your business? And feel free to mention tariff removal or anything else that falls in that category. We'll go in the same order. John, we'll start with you.
So this is a broader question, right, David? Policymakers almost globally, right? Or G7, OECD. Look, I'll go back to what I think is going to be the reality and certainly one of the biggest challenges, and that is we're seeing a renaissance of nuclear, which for interesting reasons I think is unstoppable at this time. There is a very pronounced need for the OECD countries to be able to match the type of de-risking, financing, and speed of deployment that is done with nuclear in order to keep up with power demands that are enabling things like AI and other critical security issues, not to mention the whole human side of this around enabling developing nations to have abundant power for health and education and all sorts of other reasons. So this is my advice would be that we have to collaborate and coordinate and be able to find the solutions, a sort of Western or OECD type formula for being able to match the speed and scale that we're seeing in China and Russia.
Super, thanks. Pete, lightning? Yep.
Just real quick, a couple thoughts. So we operate in 5 G7 nations, so we think about this a lot, and there's gas that moves through our pipelines that flows to the other 2 and many other countries. Capital flows where it's welcome. So I think getting these policy elements in place and on a durable basis, whether that's tax policy that is encouraging investment in energy infrastructure, whether it's the permitting issues that we touched on briefly as well. I would underscore Halima's point earlier around how energy is playing a constructive role in the context of this complicated series of trade negotiations everywhere all at once. Whether that's finding mutual opportunities of alignment for U.S. and other trading partners in the energy space, or whether that's in the context of what Canada can continue to offer the United States to balance and provide energy security. So energy security as a geopolitical tool and an area of alignment, I think that is the right place to focus, and certainly central to what's happening over the next 2 days here in Toronto.
Great.
Just very quickly would say, listen, we are fortunate. We sit on one of the best, lowest risk heavy oil resources on the planet. We know how to develop it. There's almost zero technical risk. We just need to apply the capital and the resources and get to it. The world wants it. I think our G7 allies would love nothing more than to see us producing that and serving those markets. This will take a decidedly domestic tone here, though, in response to your question. We're the only ones that can get in our own way, frankly, and we did a pretty good job of that over the last decade. Yet, as we heard from Enercan this morning, I think there's been a real change of tone in Canada. Bill C-5, there's an incredible focus on getting big projects going, getting the economy going. And but I also understand a healthy skepticism, until you actually prove that you can do it. And we just got to show that Canadians still have some grit and we can do big things and can just stay out of our own way.
That's great. Well, we saw the Blue Jays. Canadians have grit. So terrific. Well, it's time for our fireside chat with Dan Dorner from the. Yeah, you want to do it? Yes. Great. I could.
It's okay, David. Last thing I would say is how we think about strategic stockpiles matter. And so the United States has drawn down its SPR significantly. We're now talking about the need to have stockpiles of critical minerals. I think we need to be very, very serious about how G7 countries engage on stockpiles, coordination on stockpiles in terms of crises, because there's one country that has been stockpiling like crazy, and that has been China.
It's our turn. Terrific. Well, can I hand for the panel here? Thank you all. Don't go anywhere. Next up, we have a fireside chat with Dan Dorner from the IEA and Landon Darrens.
Yeah, let's match our pictures. Yours is nicer. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to keep the conversation going. And a year ago, we had the opportunity to have the executive director of the International Energy Agency join us for our first summit with the G7, the Summit on the Future of Energy. And it's a pleasure to continue that conversation, have an opportunity here to be joined by Dan Dorner, who's the International Energy Agency's head for strategic initiatives and a Sherpa to, I believe, the UN and programs like the G7 here. Dan, it's been a long-term relationship. You can't work in Washington, D.C. and not have a partnership with the International Energy Agency. And I personally have a history of thinking through energy security with the IEA and my capacity previously in the U.S. government. So I'm excited to be joined by you here today and welcome.
Thanks so much. Great to be here.
So I was with the International Energy Agency earlier this year. We met in London to have a conversation on this specific issue. And so I'm interested as we come off a conversation on kind of defining the broad slate of energy security issues. And I think we saw quite a show of force. It's technological issues. It's a need for a build first culture as new technologies and then artificial intelligence enters the market. It's the hard security of Ukraine, of China, of sanctions. And I'm curious to have your take as not just moving from London to the G7 ministerial here and then the next G7 ministerial that'll happen in France. How is the International Energy Agency scoping the story around energy security and prioritizing energy security in that context.
Brilliant. Thanks, Landon. And look, it's great to be here and always great to know that the IEA and the Atlantic Council are once again moving in lockstep in focusing on the future of energy security, and good to be here at the Monk School and to join you all here today. I think when we look back over the last few years, we all know here very well in this room that we have faced, confronted, tackled a large and diverse range of energy security events, possibly most poignantly and most tragically in Ukraine, as was touched on earlier by the deputy ministers. And I think, from a political standpoint, that means that energy security as an issue is more and more making it to the leaders' table. Again, as we saw in the G7 earlier this year in the context of the Critical Minerals Action Plan as one great example. But I think one of the key reasons for bringing together 60 countries, 50 CEOs in London, kindly hosted by Prime Minister Keir Starmer and the government of the UK earlier this year, was a recognition that in this context, with all of these events happening, we needed to make sure that we were both paying very close proactive attention to energy security in each part of the system, but also starting to really map out and take a much more holistic approach across the system as a whole. Because the interactions, interconnections, and interdependencies are evolving very quickly and in many cases growing. So this holistic approach is really, it's very complicated, and it's an agenda that we're going to have to carry forward now and for years to come, because we need to make sure that we don't lose sight of the traditional energy security risks that we've all been working on for very many years. But we can also see an evolution happening in very many spaces as well, such as electricity security, as many countries are moving increasingly towards an age of electricity, with electricity being even more central to both their energy systems and their economies. And really these emerging risks, such as critical minerals, which is going to be such a big part of the discussion here today, but also during the G7 presidency, also the interaction between AI and other sources of demand and how that's going to impact on the energy system. So I think you're really trying to map out this whole system, this holistic approach, because it's those pieces that we don't see or we don't understand fully that could come back to bite us. We want to make sure that doesn't happen. And I think across all of those areas, our executive director really highlighted what he thought were three kind of tried and tested golden rules of energy security that have served us well in eras of the past, the present, and I think so in the future too. Diversification, absolutely critical, should go without saying, but it's not one that we can take for granted. And there's certainly areas, as we're touching on, of concentration that need proactive efforts to make sure that that's dealt with. And then predictability. The energy sector always invests huge sums of money over long periods of time. And we've seen that is, we need to make sure the policy environment is predictable, the investment environment is suitable to keep the cost down for those investments and to give reassurance on the returns on those investments. And then international cooperation, which again is very much speaking to the G7 meetings happening here in Toronto, very much speaking to the cooperation that's being built around critical minerals, because it is an interconnected global energy system, and none of us are fully independent of one another. And so the role of the G7 and other collaborative fora remains absolutely crucial.
So I want to connect some dots in terms of the systems approach you're talking about and these golden rules. When I was in the White House in 2019 in particular, we had the Abqaiq attack, right? And you look at the most acute, overt issue of oil market security that we had been planning for decades. And it almost passes with the blink of an eye, and a lot of credit to international partnerships and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and its response rate to that. But that upends now the culture in which we initially sought to build our security establishments around. So if you're looking at a systems approach, and obviously you alluded to the fact that you continue at the International Energy Agency to look at oil market security, but now you have to think about security in a different lens. How do you prepare? What does diversification look like in the context of policy in Paris as you sit down and say, okay, the power markets now take precedent, critical minerals now take precedence? What is the change? Because historically was strategic stocks. And now we're thinking much more comprehensively.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, we start from the basis that the IEA is and always has been an all fuels and all technologies agency. So we've always tried to take this overarching umbrella view of how the energy system is working. But then you need to take a very kind of systematic approach piece by piece. And so I think, for all of us within the agency working across our individual sectors, fuels, technologies, we start with the data. We build the data and we rely on the data. We take that into the analysis, the insight, the policy advice, the best practice, building the systems and the processes together with our member governments and partners, bringing together the collaboration and the cooperation. So it's making sure that in each of the individual areas, you have all of those pieces that you need, starting with the data. And then you make sure that once you've got all of those pieces, and I think when we look at some of the emerging areas, we don't have all of those pieces, or at least not as good as we need them to be. And then you start to look about how they all interact, where the tensions are, where the opportunities are. Because I think, we can see, the efforts that we've put in. I mean, I think, the electricity security might be a good example, critical minerals, absolutely another, but electricity security, a few years ago, we were pushing the need to prioritize much more investment in grids. And it had been a topic not talked about, not focused on for very many years. Now it's one that people, I think, take for granted and realize how important that was. We've already talked about the fact that nuclear is now a conversation that can be had again and is being had very often. Again, another one where we're saying we need to put much more focus and attention on this, and then start to build up these pieces and start to make sure that these things are not ignored or overlooked, because they're all important, they're all pieced together. And as I say, we then look at the new drivers of demand on the electricity side. And just earlier this year, we put out our energy and AI report to try and help people understand what the demand growth profile may look like, what the interactions may be in terms of energy needed for AI and the role of AI in terms of the evolution of the energy sector. So I think we look to build it up kind of piece by piece and make sure that both we as an agency, our member countries, and through other collaborative fora, that the attention is really being put where it needs to be.
Well, with a decade or more of history at the IEA, and knowing that you were a WEO, a World Energy Outlook whiz for a long time, still are, I want to pick up on that demand signal because it deals directly with the international cooperation and the ideas of energy security as well. So this third golden rule of the IEA that you talk about here on international cooperation, it's telling that right now you're opening up or celebrating in Singapore this expansion into new markets and have a corporate headquarters there in Southeast Asia. The demand signal from the IEA has waned over time, and the composite of formal member countries is changed. And so, can you build out a little bit more about why international cooperation in this context becomes one of those elements of the Golden Rule, and in the context of the security side, and how you're thinking about bringing harmony between very disparate national interests?
Yeah, absolutely. I think can be disparate national interests towards a common goal. I mean, I think the summit earlier this year that we had 60 governments, way beyond IEA membership, and from all parts of the world and all stages of energy and economic development, who wanted to come and have 2 days of intense discussion on energy security because they saw the relevance and importance of it for themselves and for working together with others on it. And I think we see that in that summit. We've seen it in the G7. We've seen it in the G20 just recently, where again, there was a focus on trying to think about how African countries can capture more of the benefits of their own critical minerals, their own natural resources, getting up the value chain there. And I think that I think there is a lot of common interest, even if they're coming from slightly different perspectives. And then I think, for us as an agency to serve our members best, we really need to be able to see that whole global picture, be it, investing our time and effort to make sure that we could bring the best data and analysis on China, on India, on Africa, on Latin America, on Southeast Asia, which has just gone from strength to strength over the last few years. Because if we can't see that whole picture, then there's always a risk that we're not giving governments and industry the best advice.
It does seem there's an area of common interest that we've heard about already in the context of the G7 today, and I want to deep dive a technology. We had the special envoy for critical mineral partnerships, Isabella Chan, here giving keynote remarks earlier. Critical minerals are on the scope for the G7 docket. It's also on the scope for the IEA and thinking about this next generation of clean energy supply chains. And so let's do a little bit of a deep dive in terms of how we're addressing that acute issue moving forward. Are we on the right track? Do we need to do more? What are you looking for from success in the G7 side?
So we're absolutely on the right track. I think one of the things that we all feel in this particular moment and juncture is the political urgency. So I think, we put out our first kind of critical minerals market report in 2021, and we did a lot of investment before that time to build our capacity, our data, our insights to be able to do that. We had a global critical minerals summit in 2023, and we've been trying to really highlight the amazing concentration risks when it comes to critical minerals, from the mining through to the refining, and trying to make sure that people understood how big a risk this was. Whatever may trigger a disruption, whatever the cause may be, this was something that really absolutely needed policymakers and industries' attention, and it's certainly got it. Not always for good reasons, unfortunately, but it's something we've been trying to highlight for a long time. The problem is, there are some levers that you can pull from a policymaker's perspective and in some parts of the energy system that can bring some relief quite quickly. And there are some other parts of the energy system and some other levers that really take a long time to pay off. And ultimately, this is definitely an area where we need to kind of pull all of the levers as quickly as we can, but knowing that not all of them are going to pay off overnight.
This is a little bit off script, but it deals with the relationship. You talk about the supply chain concentration really in China, right? It's 90% of the supply chain in terms of processing. I get these back and forth. It's 60% mining, 90% processing.
So it's over 7. So for 19 of the 20 strategic minerals and metals that we follow, over 70% of the refining capacity is in China.
So when I look at that scale of concentration, it makes me think of the IEA from two different angles. One, there are other countries that have superiority and technologies. You think about Qatar and its ability, if it wanted to produce more LNG, it could saturate the market. The question I have for you is has China's concentration actually inspired something new? Are you seeing any innovation or policies coming out of IEA countries in a response? Because I feel we went through a period where we felt on energy transitions, we had to be incredibly prescriptive about how you actually solve every problem, and weren't giving a lot of breadth and depth to the creativity and how we've succeeded over the last half century following the Arab oil embargo, right? And so I'm curious if you're seeing new trends that maybe come from that that concentration or security vulnerability that go outside of just strategic stocks.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the urgency, the imperative of it is absolutely there to act. I think one of the things I'm very heartened by is when you look across what action is being taken place. It's well organized and orchestrated. It's not just thinking about how do we ramp up supply as quickly as we can, or how do we build stocks as quickly as we can. It's also thinking about how do we recycle, how do we diversify supply across different parts of the world, how do we innovate into new solutions and technologies that reduce our reliance on where the vulnerabilities are the greatest. So I think the fact that you can see that all parts of the solution are being looked at, not just we need to build up stocks as quickly as possible, but we shouldn't, that stocks point is still important. So I don't want to undervalue or underestimate it. I mean, and also emergency policies more broadly. I mean, we can see now, look back over history, a huge number of countries now have and have had for a long time oil security, oil emergency policies and strategies, including storage. Over the last decade, we saw that ramp up significantly in the case of natural gas, but we're only just now seeing that starting to tick up in the case of critical minerals. And so again, that certainly needs to be an important part of the solution and is going to take time to roll out.
And do you find the member countries pretty uniform in their support for those type of policies?
I think you can see a uniformity or a collegiality in the need for action. I think you can see that countries are often in a different place, in a different space about what action they feel that they can take or how quickly they can take it.
Next year, I already alluded to this, the G7 will move to France and continue this progression. That's home turf for you. So I'm interested, building on what you've already achieved earlier this year in the spring in London, here being in the G7 and being part of the dialogue now. What does success look like? This is very much a progression. It doesn't happen in a snap. And so talk to me about where we should be and your expectations a year from now.
So you're absolutely right in saying that it's a progression. So I think in kind of international cooperation, we're often thinking about the stepping stones and moving from one stone to the next, because while the political imperative of the day may change from one meeting to another or one presidency to another, the actual action, implementation, the change on the ground takes much longer and needs continuity across meetings, across presidencies. So I think Canada this year has picked up, including in some areas from previous presidencies, has really picked up the mantle and carried us forward in a very meaningful, positive way. And I hope that France next year does the same thing, and we make sure that we're not just starting from a blank sheet of paper. We're recognizing that these are important issues for all G7 members and need to be carried forward in multiple ways. I know that France has also put a great priority on energy and AI, including President Macron's summit earlier this year, the work that we've been doing with them. And actually the next phase of our work as an agency is really going to be doing the deep dive on the security aspects of the relationship between energy and AI. We've put out the kind of first pass on trying to bring the numbers, bring the analysis in this fast moving area. The next stage for us is to take a more deep dive in the security specific aspects. And we can bring that into the G7, and we'll also bring that into our own IEA ministerial, which is in February next year.
So is it fair to say, you obviously can't speak for the government of France, but maybe a peek behind the curtain that we could see some AI relevance on the agenda?
I certainly can't speak for the government of France. I can certainly speak to the fact that I know that that issue is a high priority for them. We've already talked about nuclear a lot this morning. Again, I would imagine that will be a priority for a French presidency. So I think these are just a couple of the areas that I would be looking out for next year.
And final question, I'm going to flip the script. David Goldwyn asked our prior panel what advice industry has for policymakers. I think we're in a quasi space of influencing policy. We're not in governments, but we deal with them quite actively. What would you tell to industry and non-government stakeholders that they need to be thinking about to have an impact on energy security as they deal with opportunities like the G7?
It's a great question. I wish I'd prepped for it. I think one of the aspects that we haven't touched on much here, but came up a lot again in London earlier this year and is coming up in multilateral fora, is looking at energy security in a broader context. So economic security has been touched on here, and rightly so. But again, economic security means different things in different parts of the world and as it relates to the energy sector. So, in thinking about the agenda going forward, access, affordability, competitiveness are all important parts of that interrelationship between energy and economic security, and working with the policymakers and helping them understand how they can set agendas with industry that can help improve access, can help improve affordability for citizens and consumers, and can help competitiveness for their broader economy. I think that is still a very live and somewhat under-tapped conversation that could happen over the course of the next year.
Oh, well, for a lack of prep, that was pretty good. Dan, thank you to the International Energy Agency for joining us here. Really great to continue this collaboration and appreciate your continued focus on energy security. If you could all join me in thanking Dan for his time.
Thank you so much.
And now give us 2 minutes while we reset the stage and have our second panel of the day.
We don't have a clock here. Oh, okay, good. Okay. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Welcome back. We're working on, we've had a couple of really interesting discussions this morning. And so we're going to continue that with this panel. So thank you very much for coming back and, recognizing the pace of this conference. It's going to go very quickly. And there was a very interesting first panel as well. I got a lot out of it, and this panel is going to be touching a lot of the same issues, but perhaps from some different perspectives. Just generally, what we're going to look at is the issue of increased demand, particularly electricity demand, very controversial issues with respect to the energy sector. But one of the least controversial ones is an expectation of growth, and particularly electricity growth. So we're going to have this panel speak to that. It's my pleasure to kind of lead the discussion. And just by way of background, my name is George Vague. I'm a senior fellow here at the Munk School, and until recently, I was chair of the Canada Energy Regulator. So I'm very interested in these issues as they come up. And as I say, we're going to talk about the issues of demand, which is something that we talked about in the similar panel, earlier panel. We're going to have a lot of issues with overlap, but just to set this up a bit, there are, in the demand story, there are a number of interesting political and policy and political issues that arise from that, including the role of different generation technology types and portfolios, the role of fossil fuels, nuclear power in particular, that I know was talked about at the in the earlier panel. We're going to talk about electricity prices, because that's going to be a very important issue. This is all going to cost an awful lot of money, and there are a lot of demands on consumers and governments for money. And finally, how countries can work together to address this, because there is something a little parochial about energy very often. Every country, every sub-jurisdiction wants self-sufficiency. So we have an excellent panel to be discussing these issues, and I'll introduce them to you, starting with Will at the side, Will Hazelip. And each of the panel members bring, I mean, they have a professional position which provides a perspective, but they also have a very interesting background that also contributes to the perspective. So Will is the president of National Grid Ventures. We're all familiar with National Grid. It provides, electricity transmission in UK and US, but he's with National Grid Ventures. So it's a competitive affiliate with the regulated company. So a combination of experience with entrepreneurial growth and regulated activities and regulated growth. Next to Will is Lindsay Merrill. Lindsay's from Engine Number One, which is an investment firm investing in companies pursuing innovation and reindustrialization. And before that, she had 15 years in the US government at the Pentagon and at the Treasury. Next to Lindsay is Helen Curry, who's the chief economist at ConocoPhillips. We all know, a leading energy company. But her background is as a finance professor and as an academic as well. So we'll benefit from that, also in government and in economic analysis. And then finally, next to me is John Stockhouse, well known to a lot of people in the room, Senior Vice President Office of the CEO at RBC Capital Markets. And as I say, a well-known Canadian thought leader on economic innovation and editor-in-chief of the Globe and Mail. And I'll also add a senior fellow here at the Munk School. So how we're going to have our conversation is that I will lead off an introduction to some topics, and we'll have the speakers go one by one to make a point, and then have others respond to that as well. So why don't we just get right into it? And as I said at the outset, there is a broad consensus that G7 countries will face accelerated demand increases over the next several years. And this is all based on assumptions and projections around the pace of electrification, including transportation, heating, electrifying industries, industrial policy, and it's sometimes called reindustrialization, and of course, AI and data centers, which there's a lot of focus on. And so the first question for the panels, and maybe Lindsay, I'll ask you to lead this off. So there's a pretty broad consensus. Do any of the panel members see any concerns with that consensus? Are there any holes in it, or at least to question some of the premises of accelerated demand? And as I say, maybe Lindsay, you could lead us off on that.
Sure, and thank you, George, for that question. I'd like to thank the Atlantic Council and the Munk School for having us here today. Landon and your team, I'm sure he's out working, is excellent. So thank you for putting this all together. We continue to talk about the increased demand that we're going to have to solve for globally and locally. And I think one of the hardest parts is how do we benchmark that number? I think all of us are working towards increased demand, but how much actually increased demand and where specifically? Not only the industries that you mentioned, George, and transportation and in education and industry, but AI is really driving this demand growth. And where is AI going to need that kind of power load in order to accomplish what they need to in terms of training and inference? And I think as we were preparing for this panel, we talked a bit about the global energy security and local energy security, and I kind of am seeing those as one and the same. When Russia invaded Ukraine, it was Qatar and the United States who diverted cargoes from Asia to Europe to make sure that the Europeans had enough for the winter, and that pulled away from some of our local need. And so as we're looking as a G7 and as countries and as the United States and as Canada, where is it that we need to be building our demand so that we can help others meet their demand, but also meet the demand at home? I'm sure we'll get into this, but we continue to talk about pipeline constraints in the United States. And as we're exporting to Europe, how are we going to be building for our demand at home? And speaking to different hyperscalers, we have different numbers of how many gigawatts they need for each of their data centers. And how are we going to be making molecules flow to their data centers and their industry if we're also exporting. So I think this is an excellent opportunity to have this conversation at the G7, and I look forward to hearing more of the data and the numbers.
Thank you, Lindsay. And perhaps, John, I could ask you to go next and we'll lead you.
Yeah, thanks for including me and RBC in this conversation. We're really proud partners with Atlantic Council on a lot of energy issues. So it's great to be together and be able to see the world come to Toronto. Something I stressed to another audience in town this morning was we have to continue to approach these challenges collectively, and the G7 is actually a very effective body for G7 plus for this. No country is going to solve this on their own. So great to hear and be part of these conversations. A few maybe macro views. Demand is going to be very unevenly distributed. From a macro perspective, as you all know, economic growth and population over the long term are the two key drivers. A number of G7 countries have gone over or going over a demographic cliff, so let's not lose sight of that. We here in North America have a much better demographic outlook. Depending, of course, on how we approach immigration, but that will be worked out in the long term. There will be reasonable population growth and above norm economic growth in our view over the long term. So you can see energy demand going with that. It will be distributed unevenly even within markets. So for us within North America, driven by three big forces at play, industrialization, militarization, and digitalization. So just quickly on each of those, industrialization, reshoring. We're seeing a great effort to bring more production capacity, but that includes in the resources sector, which is going to bring with it a significant energy demand. We've already heard about digitalization and all that is going on with AI. We think some technology innovations are going to maybe flatten the curve a little bit, but is going to be a significant demand driver over the next decade. No doubt about that. And probably overlooked in a lot of these conversations is what I'm calling militarization. We're all going to be spending a whole lot more on security. If you do the math on 5% of GDP for NATO spend, this is extraordinary. This is $2 trillion that is going to be largely new spend. And all that spend, or a good chunk of it, is going to bring with it energy demands. You don't build things that have to move and have to do things in different theaters, even in peacetime, without understanding the energy demands for that. And they're not static demands, as you all know. So in my mind, that's one of the more interesting and concerning variables, because with that increased spend is going to come a lot of energy demand. Wars are won with energy security through history, so we should anticipate that to continue. There may be greater competition for energy resources and energy security, both near term and long term, but also greater opportunity for innovation, because the energy needs of satellites and drones and sea drones are very different from, say, current infrastructure and vehicles and other needs in our military system. So a hopeful opportunity there for innovation.
Thank you, John. Will, did you want to add something?
Sure. Just to add a bit onto the point about local differences and the regional perspective. First of all, thanks to the Atlantic Council and Munk School for having me. So in New York, the load forecast is now 10 gigawatts, and that just went up 4 gigawatts in the last quarter. And that's for a 35 gigawatt system. And so, there are lots of differences in different places about how this will play out. And that's somewhat distributed between manufacturing as well as data centers. So it's not just the absolute amount of load as well. It's the relative change and the pace of change that these regions are experiencing. And then, importantly, the ability for a region, a state to be able to manage that change, which I think we'll come on to with some future questions.
Thank you, Will. Yeah, it was great that the panel members broke this down a bit. We want to go a little further in breaking this down. And Helen, I'm going to turn to you on on this one, because now the question is, okay, so there's a consensus around increased demand. It's a little more nuanced as to where it takes place and the pace of it taking place. It's going to vary. It's going to be very local. But this demand has to be met by something. And we're going to talk about some supply resources. This has been mentioned in the earlier panel, but I think it's worth considering as well here with respect to electricity demand. A couple of supply sources are getting a lot of attention recently. Fossil fuel generation and nuclear power. And just a bit of a setup. With respect to fossil fuel generation in particular, many jurisdictions have relaxed some of the decarbonization requirements and are relying on or forecasting an increasing role for gas-fired generation. And even we see in Saskatchewan, they've announced that they're going to refurbish their coal-fired generation to meet demand. And with respect to nuclear, as people in this room know, many jurisdictions are looking to revive nuclear generation to meet increasing demands. But the history of nuclear rebuild has often been marked by delays and cost increases. So, Helen, maybe I could ask you to address what's your view of the continued and future role for gas-fired generation and for nuclear generation?
Sure. Thank you, George. And first, let me thank the Atlantic Council for hosting this today. It's a great program. Could not be more timely, I think. So let me first maybe play off of some of the comments that were made earlier regarding the whole discussion around load growth and electricity growth. We fully agree that electricity loads will be growing. It's a bit of an eye opener to many onlookers, I suppose, that after over a decade of relatively flat load growth across many countries, we're now suddenly waking up to this large trajectory shift. And we see the data center element of that as part of a broader array of activities that are electrifying. We've mentioned those. Industrial processes, transportation. So a lot of pulls on the need for electricity and energy more broadly, and the whole discussion around energy security also just could not come at a more important time for us. So when we then think about where does this energy come from, and ConocoPhillips is a global oil and gas producer. Of course, we've been here in Canada for over a century. We see. First and foremost, we see energy as an all of the above type proposition. And that should come as a surprise to no one, in my opinion. Across the United States, Canada, all of the G7 countries, all countries around the world for that matter, everyone is adding any and every kind of energy that they can, whether it's renewable electricity, nuclear, coal-fired generation. It's everything. And what's very important within that for my company in particular is natural gas. Natural gas is a clean burning fuel that can be delivered in many places on short notice. The turbines ramp up quickly. The whole host of advantages for natural gas fired electricity. And when you also think about where does electricity come from today across G7 countries, for example. Roughly a third of electricity delivered across G7 countries in 2024 was from natural gas. At least a half of the electricity generated in G7 countries in 2024 was fossil fuels. So the point I'm getting at is fossil fuels continue to be a very important part of the overall energy mix as well as electricity. They're needed for reliability, affordability, and then there's the security component.
Well, thank you, Helen. Any other thoughts from the panel members on these generation technologies or anything or other generation technologies that we could start to see more of to meet this demand?
I might jump in and say there's an opportunity for certainly in a G7 context to have more alignment, particularly around standards, around supply chains, even around regulatory approaches. So nuclear is a classic example. We're all in different ways pretty good at nuclear. We think in Canada we're really good at it, especially on SMRs, but not exclusively there. How do we not only align but supply our G7 allies plus others with nuclear technologies, but also with best practices? How do we reduce duplication in permitting and regulation by aligning standards? How do we share data? So lots of opportunities, big and small there. We might suggest the same for natural gas and particularly LNG, more advanced. The market has done wonderful things on its own, but there may be an opportunity. We put out a paper this year on a G7 plus strategy for LNG, including financing infrastructure. So how do we help allied countries through multilateral development banks, which currently some of them are not allowed to finance LNG infrastructure? How do we use our ownership and our capital commitments to those banks to help our partners develop the infrastructure to use more of that LNG for all sorts of advantages? Same with supply chains and also with offtake agreements, even among partners. So all of that probably familiar to everyone in the room, but the G7 is one of several good tables to try to bring around that alignment and take a bit more of that collective and competitive spirit to these two of these energy sources, which I think we all know are going to be even more significant in the mix in the 2030s.
Thank you. Lindsay.
And if I can just add to that from the investment perspective, like Helen said, this is an all the above approach. And so it's fossil fuels, it's oil and gas, but we also need to maintain our investment in innovative technologies and renewables like wind and solar, like battery storage, and like nuclear. Unfortunately, nuclear is so expensive, and every time we talk about it, it's still 5 years out, even 10 years ago, for SMRs and other nuclear technologies. So what we're doing here at Engine No. 1, we're an investment firm. We're building power plants. We have strategic partnerships with GE Vernova. We announced our partnership with Chevron in January of this year. We're about to announce our first site and break ground on our first project in Texas. And our projects, our power plants that we're building are natural gas fired turbines, but they have battery storage, wind and solar, and in some places CCS capability. All of this is going to be driven by customer wants, customer needs. So it's our job as builders to provide them that optionality. They ultimately will have to be the ones paying for this. But it is also very difficult to have this conversation without addressing the policy piece. Obviously in the United States, bipartisan system, last administration looked very different in terms of renewables than it does today in the United States. So what does that do in driving investment towards renewables and towards other innovative technologies? And how are we going to continue to offer that optionality if building these power plants costs tens of billions of dollars and requires tens of thousands of acres and takes more than 5 to 6 to 7 years to build? That's more than one administration. And so to move that amount of money over such a short amount of time is a lot to ask of the private sector when the regulators are not going to be fighting for you. But I think it's also interesting because that's why the constant is the private sector. And that's why we need to pull together to find these creative solutions and drive the growth where we're seeing it across the United States and across the G7 and globally, and identify creative solutions and find ways to have regulators support that.
Well, thank you. Will, please.
Sure. And just to follow up on that, the policy support is absolutely critical. And, unfortunately, we see a lot of movement on the pendulum swinging back and forth. Some of that's been welcome to see, again, in the Northeast U.S., where all of the above is now being talked about. Unfortunately, at the federal level, that doesn't seem to include renewables as much, which I think misses an important point. So natural gas fired generation is critical, will continue to be critical to not just meet increasing demand, but maintain reliability in many, many parts of the electric system. But natural gas fired generation consumes 36% of natural gas in the United States. So if you're able to meet some of that demand with renewables, that's more natural gas that can be liquefied and exported, which obviously has a security component to that. So Unfortunately, it seems like there's a little bit of a too myopic of a view at the federal level when it comes to renewables. I also think we'll see more innovation, technological innovation, or willingness to use other types of generation technologies like fuel cells, anything that can come faster. So the speed element, the need to get power generation on the system as quickly as possible is starting to produce some results we probably wouldn't have seen a few years ago.
Thanks, Will. John, did you have a? Thanks, Will. I'm going to pick up on a point you made and ask you to lead off the next discussion as well, because as we know, increased demand, everyone's enthusiastic about that for building, but it also leads to increase in electricity pricing. And that puts pressure on governments and it puts pressures on industry. And in terms of governments, history suggests that in many jurisdictions, consumers have looked to governments as much as anyone else to mitigate price increases, often transferring costs from ratepayers to taxpayers. And in terms of industry, you mentioned innovation. Could you just address then, how should governments respond to these pressures to subsidize electricity consumption? We certainly have a lot of that here in Ontario. And in terms of industry, how can industry respond to their customers to help the customers respond to the challenges of rising electricity prices? And maybe we'll lead it off with you again.
Sure. Yeah, this is it's a very complex question. And I think we are seeing governments respond now to affordability issues. One thing that comes to mind is all customers are certainly not created equal when it comes to energy and their ability to pay for energy, yet it remains critical, fundamental necessity. And so I think that's the fundamental challenge that governments have. So whether it's a retail consumer that needs to heat their house or it's industry in economic development, there's a kind of a complex interplay. And one of the challenges that governments have is kind of navigating their way through, in particular places that haven't seen a lot of economic development or economic development tied to energy use in the recent past. We're seeing more challenge in those areas, kind of grappling with this. But demand can be a good thing. Increased demand can be a good thing, especially if it's handled appropriately, and some of that demand is more willing to pay higher costs as well. So we do a lot of our assets are electricity and natural gas networks. So it's kind of fixed infrastructure that you kind of have to pay a flat rate for. Well, that rate can go down if you're moving more kilowatt hours through. So that's where load growth can actually be a positive thing to actually reduce the cost burden of that kind of fixed infrastructure component. And I think we're just at the beginning stages of seeing how that that might come through. And so what we're trying to do is encourage governments to think about that and not just react negatively or think that all load growth is necessarily going to be a bad thing. It certainly can be helpful, not just from what I just described, but also the economic development component. And we are starting to see a lot of positive traction in our jurisdictions around that, where again, it really hasn't been a conversation for the last 30 years.
Well, thank you, Will. Any other thoughts on the role of governments and Helen?
So I want to pick up on that. I agree with everything was just said. I think that the other thing to add to the whole thought process is going back to the supply side of the equation of the growth in load starts to put upward pressure on prices, but to the extent that policymakers and the private markets can add more supplies faster and sooner, that alleviates some of that price pressure. Granted, there are there's a lot of creativity taking place today in many locations between some of the hyperscalers and local utility rate setting commissions regarding who's going to pay for what. But I think that the real thing that punchline that people that just need to get focused on is how do we get more supplies out there faster? And that plays into the upstream resources, which we have plenty of between the U.S. and Canada. We can produce a lot of gas at some of the lowest costs in the world. We need more infrastructure to get that gas to where it needs to be. And we need the new gas-fired plants to be in place for that. So the whole conversation around permitting reform, a durable regulatory legal environment in which the private sector can allocate capital and have confidence in returns. That's what we need to make progress on.
Thank you. Go, John.
Maybe just to add a couple of points. Yeah, more supply, more efficiency. I think we'll see more demand for gas for all those good reasons. But energy, and particularly electricity inflation, has been one of the great political forces of the last quarter century. Electricity rates roughly double the inflation rate in Europe. Real electricity prices in North America, I think, up 25% over the last 25 years. It is increasingly becoming the dominant issue in Republican conversations, different parts of the U.S., but heading into the midterm years, the midterm year, I'm sorry, you all know that rates across a number of states are increasing this year at 2x or more the rate of inflation. We know how this plays out, and it doesn't play out necessarily optimally from an economist's point of view, but it plays out for those political imperatives. Governments have tried to foist a bit more pressure onto industry and manufacturing. We've seen how that's played out, certainly here in Ontario, certainly in Europe. It's one of the quickest ways to deindustrialize. So that card can't be played, which takes me back to that point about more supply, yes, but we also need to focus more on efficiency. Energy efficiency generally has kind of flatlined over the last decade, and there's all sorts of opportunities to get that curve going up again. So as we have more supply, which we need, how do we manage that more efficiently?
Thanks. Thanks, John. This leads into another conversation. I mean, we've been focusing, as energy people do, on energy investment and supply and other types of resources. And, as we've seen, or as we've discussed, both supply and transmission, which we haven't really discussed yet, will be required to meet this increased demand. But all of these investments will compete with other emerging capital priorities that our industries and our governments are facing. John, you mentioned defense, and there's other public spending demands that will continue. And so we have to consider whether the current policies respecting financing of public financing of this regulation, whether through public utility regulation or through other methods, will these be adequate, or do things have to change on that front? Are we going to need a financing type of reform to go along with all these energy reforms we've been discussing? Lindsay.
I will take a first
Thank
stab.
you.
I think as we're looking at these creative solutions that take so much investment and are so capital intensive, it is the role of the governments to set the spending priorities, but it is also their job to ensure an enabling environment to move this kind of capital and to make sure that we can grow. For us, for example, we are working on these creative solutions. We're providing behind the meter power that eventually will connect to the grid so that we can build at speed and scale for the projects and the demand growth. However, we still have to work with the federal government. We need permitting and the state and local government as well. And yesterday I came from meetings at FERC and the White House, and while they have undertaken the regulatory reform to expedite these permitting requirements and to break through the bureaucratic red tape, they are saying they don't have enough projects to demonstrate success. So we have provided one for them, and a lot of the people that we need to process this paperwork are furloughed. So I think, there are things you're not going to know until you know, and you never know until you get there, and we're there. So I think it's just trying to figure out how to work in an environment where there's a lot of political personalities, but also differences at play, and figuring out how to be nimble and how to still provide for the customer and work with the regulators and the policymakers. And I think that there are, in terms of the framework, I think that there are some really key parts of both the One Big Beautiful Bill and the IRA that are necessary in order to move this forward. And I think we all need to find some kind of a balance in the load growth and in order to ensure that we have the capital, the regulatory environment, and the customers to make this work.
Helen,
I would
please.
just add to that a little bit yeah, there are definitely some legislative provisions out there that are sort of clearing some of the pathways to help bring this forward. I was going to say, I don't necessarily think that there needs to be some new great financial framework created. We have a very flexible global financial system, I would argue. And I think there's no shortage of capital available. What we need goes back to what we were saying earlier. What you need to have in place to actually have that capital get deployed and get shovels in the ground is a durable kind of framework that provides that capital a reasonable level of confidence, reasonable level of risk that you're going to get the return that you need on it. And that plays into some of the legislative provisions that are in place and can help to move things forward.
If I can add two quick points under this new security paradigm, there may be some interesting opportunities here. Number one, I think you'll see more governments using various legislative powers to override some of these challenges. We're certainly seeing that in the United States. We're going to see, I think, a bit more of that in Canada and probably other democratic jurisdictions. Secondly, we'll probably see some more innovative uses of public balance sheets under the auspices of security, but that's a very wide definition. So RBC is helping to stand up something called the Defense, Security and Resilience Bank. It's kind of like a NATO bank of using our collective balance sheets so that we can raise capital. The capital's out there, but to lend to sovereigns, but also to backstop commercial lending. That word resilience has a very broad definition, and that can include things like transmission lines and infrastructure if it has a security imperative. So an example, in the province of Manitoba, there's an interesting project on the table to run both electricity and fiber to the Arctic, or to the far north at least, where communities now rely on diesel, and defense facilities also rely on diesel. This would be much more efficient, so you can see the dual use opportunity there. So just an example of where a public balance sheet and maybe some of that authority may be applied differently in the years ahead.
Well, thanks. We're running out of time. I wondered if I can get at least one or a couple of you to comment on the issue that would be near and dear to the G7, which is how do nations, subnational jurisdictions, we tend to be a bit parochial sometimes with energy policy, and everyone's thinking about themselves. And how do we increase more trade in energy? Canadian provinces have always had this issue, but I think even in the US states, there's questions around how effective the interstate trade is. Maybe we could just have whoever wants to address this in a minute. How can states and subnational institutions better coordinate their energy needs and investments to more efficiently and effectively deal with some of the challenges we've been discussing this morning? John? Will, I'm looking to you.
I can just provide a quick example. One of our large businesses over in the UK is connecting the UK to European countries. So we have 7.8 gigawatts of transmission lines connecting the UK to Europe, which can bring about 15% on average, 15%, supply 15% of the UK's electricity needs. So that's actually an astounding amount of electricity trade, which I think is somewhat uncommon, but maybe provides an interesting case study for folks.
Well, thank you, Will. I wish we had more time. There's so many great issues coming up, but throughout the course of the day, we'll have hallway conversations. So I just want to make some thank yous before I go. First, thanks to the people who are saying pipeline constraints and permitting restrictions are US problems. So that was nice to hear. I thought Canadians invented those problems. So it's nice to know that we're not alone. A bit of schadenfreude, if nothing else. And I do want to thank the panel for a fascinating discussion and for being able to cover this wide range of issues and in a concise and clear manner. So I think that everyone got a lot out of it. So thank you very much to the panel. And thank you to the Atlantic Council for pulling all of this together. The team has done a great job. So with that, I'll say goodbye and enjoy the World Series. Thank you. Yeah.
We'll now take a 15-minute break before we come back for our third and final panel, and some other keynote remarks, including from Minister Hutchinson. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.
Yeah, of course, yeah, I'll follow. So whatever you're I don't know if it's So like now it's experimented by. So, yes. Oh, sorry. You can watch the. I didn't notice.
Well, I mean, for us, it has. Yes. And the official marks will be on the podium. The flags over here, so that we will just behind as well. I can see that being the one is supposed to fly to me, but yeah, I think.
Well, you all didn't need that much coffee. I think we were pretty prompt. I do admire the amount of time that we actually get to spend together. We power through a lot of the panels, and I can tell you, I know that that wasn't enough time always. But a big part of the culture that we built around the G7 at the Atlantic Council this year within our Canada the Monk School is about the community. And so I just want to thank each person here in the audience. It's really important to us that we continue to have these opportunities to explore shared issues of interest. Before I move on to the rest of the panel, I do want to take a minute and acknowledge a different community because we have a really strong network of Canadian companies in particular that have made the time to make this event possible. And so to RBC, Cameco, Enbridge, the Canadian National Laboratories and Atomic Energy Canada Limited, it is an absolute pleasure to be able to work with you on this and bring these really important energy security issues to life. So as we move back in the panel, I just want to really emphasize my appreciation for your partnership. Coming back from break, as we get going, we do have an opportunity to hear from some distinguished keynote speakers, including in the next hour, the minister himself. But before we get there and before we get to our third panel, I'm particularly pleased to keep highlighting an issue that's particularly been relevant to this morning's dialogue, and the fact that nuclear energy is having a specific moment and time of the day and is a key part of our energy security. So it's with enthusiasm that I welcome Fred Diermarker, who is the president and CEO of Atomic Energy in Canada Limited. So AECL. Fred, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Dan, and thank you all as well. It's an honor to be here this morning. I do want to acknowledge and thank the Monk School, the Atlantic Council, and most important of all, I want to thank the panelists. But at the same time as thanking you, you've taken most of the remarks that I was going to make. So I don't want to repeat them. So a lot of what I'm going to say is actually going to be a bit ad hoc. Dan Dorner provided a very good overview of the event that took place in the UK earlier this year in April, the Energy Security Summit. What was remarkable about that event was you had about 50 or 60 countries, and there was a convergence, an almost unanimity of agreement on the three key points that Dan highlighted, and I'm gonna summarize them again: diversification, predictability, and collaboration. And there's been a lot of discussion about the need for diversification, so I won't touch on that too much. But I would like to highlight predictability and collaboration through my remarks. Now, momentum for nuclear is unprecedented. I've been in the industry. I started in '79 as a summer student, in '81 full-time. I have never seen the kind of momentum that we have seen, and I experienced the boom of the late '70s and early '80s. We're standing on the doorstep of an exciting time with many different technologies at different stages of development. And there's a lot of potential out there, both domestically and for new entrant countries. But when it comes to predictability, in order to achieve that, it's about matching ambition with capacity. And one of the things that worries me is when I look at new entrant countries, I'm seeing some new entrant countries that are interested in multiple different technologies. And my worry there is nuclear is complex. It's not easy to implement. You look at the regulatory capacity, the institutions, the highly qualified personnel that are needed for just one technology, and it's a big task. To take that on for multiple technologies is a big challenge. And we, in my mind, I think we have a role to play in helping new entrant countries be successful in deploying new nuclear. If for nothing else, very selfishly, if they're not successful with new nuclear, we suffer. The entire sector suffers. So we want to see everybody be successful. So when we're embarking on I think one of the key messages is we're trying to market our technologies to new countries. We need to balance that with be careful about biting off more than you can chew. And let me give you a great example that I think is a tremendous success and that I want to celebrate, and that is Romania. In Romania, they are operating 2 nuclear reactors. They're both CANDUs, and they're both amongst the world's best performing reactors. Romania was looking at getting new technology, and it was considering other technologies other than CANDU. They eventually landed on CANDU, and they landed on it with 3 other countries helping to enable that CANDU, and that was the US coming to the table with $3 billion, Canada coming to the table with $3 billion of financing, and Italy coming to the table with 2 billion euros of financing. So here you saw an example of collaboration where 3 countries are working with Romanians, but you also saw an example where you're not creating a bigger challenge for Romania than they have the capacity to be able to absorb by building on the same technology that's there. Now, if I look at Canada, Canada's in a bit of a different place. We've been in the nuclear game for, the first nuclear energy connected to the grid was in 1961. So we've been at it for over 6 decades, and we know nuclear. We have, in my view, in Canada, as a mature nuclear country, we actually have an obligation to be a leader in developing and testing new nuclear technology. And this is where I want to celebrate what's being done at Darlington with the small modular reactor. As many of you may be aware, or if you're not aware, we are building the first SMR in the G7 at the Darlington site. And less than a week ago, the federal government and the provincial government announced $3 billion of support to that project. Now, what's really important about this project, when you look at all the SMRs out there, and it's not a criticism, it's just a reflection of where we are in the evolution of SMR technologies, they're all paper reactors. Darlington is going to become the first physical reactor. And when you go out to that site, you can see they've cleared the site, they're excavating, and they're getting ready to start building. And we are working on detailed engineering, detailed construction plans for that site today. This is really significant, and it's an example of how Canada can build upon the capability that it has with CANDU technology to deploy other technologies. Having said that, countries that have become very good at one technology have a natural advantage, and they should play to their strengths. If I'm really good at hockey, I might be good at baseball, and it might be worthwhile playing baseball once in a while, but I better stick to hockey because that's where that's my strength. And I will tell you, every reactor exporting country that has developed a natural strength is building on it. When you go to France, they're building EPRs. When you go to Korea, they're building APRs. When you go to Russia, They're building VVRs. When you go to the US, they're building AP1000s. And I want to applaud Cameco, Brookfield, and the US government on this amazing announcement. $80 billion, John Gorman touched on it, $80 billion to deploy Westinghouse technology and build 10, I'm not sure of the number of reactors. John mentioned 10, but a good number of reactors. This is fabulous news, and it's very welcome news, because in nuclear, we not only have a challenge in terms of meeting energy demand, but nuclear is a form of diplomacy. When a country sells a nuclear reactor to another country, it's an 80-year or 100-year handshake. And Russia is shaking hands really well right now. They are building, as we speak, 19 reactors in 6 very strategic countries: India, Iran, Egypt, China, Turkey, and Bangladesh. They are way in the lead. China is not exporting as much, but boy, is it building capacity. It's putting online 10 new reactors a year, and they have an ambition to achieve 500 gigawatts by 2050. They also have a tremendous manufacturing overcapacity, and they are poised whenever they want to start taking on the world. So those countries, and finally, those countries have partnered together. Russia and China signed a long-term cooperation agreement in nuclear, and they're working together to put a lunar space station powered by a nuclear reactor on lunar on the moon. Yeah. So there's a lot of challenge there, and what the US is doing between the 4 directives that were issued by the administration in May of this year, and then acting on those directives by working with Brookfield and Cameco to build Westinghouse reactors is fabulous news from my perspective. So I really applaud it. But coming back to Canada, CANDU is our natural opportunity. That doesn't mean we don't build other reactors. Of course, we're building the BWRX. Westinghouse wants to build reactors in Canada, but we also want to see CANDU reactors in Canada. And CANDU offers things that no other design in the world offers. It offers natural uranium as a source of fuel. Every country that operates CANDU reactors today, in China, in Korea, in Argentina, in India, and so there are 7 countries altogether, they are making their own fuel. They are not importing enriched fuel. They're making their own fuel. They're importing the uranium in some cases, but they're making fuel out of their uranium they're importing. CANDUs can make medical isotopes. And finally, CANDUs have the best performance records in the world. When you look at 10-year capacity factors around the world, in countries that are operating CANDU and non-CANDU, there are three jurisdictions, China, Korea, and Europe. In all 3, the CANDUs are leading in terms of 10-year capacity factors. Something that we need to celebrate because we don't talk about it enough. Now, in order to make all this happen, there are several things several structural things that need to happen. First of all, industry has a key role to play in innovating and delivering predictably. So when it comes to predictability, again, that's key. Nuclear has not been that good. It has room to improve. In the refurbishments in Canada, we've been fabulous because we've delivered on time, on budget. Government also has a key role to play in creating demand for nuclear. In the 1970s, when we saw the big boom, Canada was adding 1 new reactor every year. France was adding about 4 reactors every year. The US was adding about 7 reactors every year. And demand was strong naturally because of the energy crisis, or crises, as I should say. There were 2 in the 70s. And build-outs were done with very strong government support. Fast forward to today, Ontario's independent electrical system operator has done something absolutely essential to create that same kind of demand. They have signaled the need for 18 gigawatts by 2050. And in response to that, the Ontario utilities have made announcements to build reactors at Bruce, at Darlington, and at Wesleyville. So government has a role in saying this is the power that we need, and it's got to be a lot. It can't just be one or two. And this enables the supply chain to gear up. It enables the universities, the colleges to gear up and to plan. Government has a second important role to play, and they have to do this with industry, and it was touched on in earlier panels. It's to create an environment for attracting private capital. We're going to be spending trillions over the next quarter century, trillions on electrification. And in Canada alone, it'll be around, based on studies we've done, we're estimating at least 600 billion. So when you look, the investment is significant. We need private capital. And we need financing structures to make private investing in new nuclear comparable to investing in other infrastructure projects. And the private sector has a really important role to play in coming up with innovative schemes that will work for them and that will also work for governments. I'd like to point to the Sizewell C project in the UK. It's a $38 billion new nuclear project, and it has successfully attracted competition from private equity firms to have an equity stake. That's exactly where we want to be. We want to see private equity competing for new nuclear projects. And finally, we need to prepare the public to accept that the cost of energy going forward will be higher in the future than it was in the past. We are enjoying the fruits of energy investments made by our parents and grandparents today, and new investments in energy will drive up the cost of energy, especially in the short term. And especially with nuclear that has a large upfront cost, but a very long timeline to deliver back. We owe it to the public, both industry and government together, to help them to understand that energy has value, and it has significant value, and we underestimate its value. We have people that are willing to pay more for cell phone plans than they are for the electricity plans. It has value well beyond the low prices we are paying today, regardless of the energy choice. So to conclude, with the right forward-looking strategy, with investment, with leadership, and with strong partnerships between government and the private sector, building new nuclear will be our gift to our children and their children. And there are many challenges ahead, but I'm personally very excited about where we're at and where we're going. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Fred, for this fantastic keynote and setting up our next panel perfectly. If I could just ask my panelists to join me on stage. I'm Lee Beck. I'm a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and very excited to be back here. Thank you so much to the Munk School for hosting us here. And I also just want to say thank you to the Atlantic Council and the Atlantic Council staff for putting this on. And Landon, you already said a lot of thank yous, so I wanted to say thank you to you, but also your fantastic team, Katie, Natalia, Elena, Reed. If everyone could give me a hand in just thanking them. Thank you. A lot of work goes into making these perfectly polished events happen all over the world and bringing us together, so I just want to make sure we're acknowledging that. And without further ado, last but not least, our third panel here today. I just want to set it up with a few thoughts because we've heard a lot about technology isn't the bottleneck today, but it's really about how we execute and deliver steel in the ground. So we'll talk about that today. We also heard that we're seeing a new industrial era, but this new industrial era also demands new partnerships with governments, the private sector, and other entities, in particular amongst the G7. So we'll hear from our panelists on this as well. And we've seen some of these partnerships announced in the news already yesterday. I think we've talked about it. And then I think we'll try to integrate all of what we're hearing from this panel within the energy security or security conversation overall and make some core recommendations on what we'd like to see from the G7. So we're here today furthest to the right, from my right, is Jennifer Granton. She's the Chief Global Affairs Officer with Commonwealth Fusion Systems, which is really the next innovation frontier. And I'm very much excited to hear from her about timelines for fusion. We talked about this earlier. Next to her is Michelle Patron, who's the General Manager for Energy and Sustainability at Microsoft. And I wrote down here, Michelle, that you're really the next demand frontier. But what I learned from you in the coffee break is you're really all about supply. So can't wait to hear and talk about that. And then, of course, Roger Martella, who's the Chief Corporate Officer at GE Vernova, always with us at the Atlantic Council, and a global engineering and innovation muscle. So fantastic to have you. And last but not least, Grant Isaac, who's the President and Chief Operating Officer at Cameco, which, again, anchors the supply side and new partnerships. So I want to start with you, Jennifer, and Roger, because we're obviously here at the G7. 18 months ago, many of us actually met in Torino at the last Atlantic Council G7 forum. And the communique back then was already seen as a breakthrough in terms of technology innovation. But I want to hear from you, what did we see back then and what has changed since then? Maybe Jennifer, if you want to kick us off, and then over to you, Roger.
Yeah, sure. I'll go ahead and start and take a bit of a fusion lens on here, because probably half the audience isn't even aware of fusion and where fusion is and what's happening. But it was a breakthrough for us at the last meeting in Torino, where fusion was added to the G7 communique. It's becoming clear that this is a new technology. There have been technology breakthroughs that have happened. We're now on timelines of seeing commercial fusion energy on the grid starting in the early 2030s and scaling hopefully very quickly after that. And so what we need are a couple things in place to do that. We need access to capital. And so we've seen an increase in the capital flowing in from the private sector. But we're also going to be starting to think about sort of infrastructure financing and those type of things as you move towards scaling an industry. But we also need the policies and regulations in place for a brand new industry that didn't exist before. Fusion's very different than fission. Happy to go into explaining that, but the safety parameters are quite different. So the US and the UK have already decided to regulate it very differently. It's going to be regulated more like a particle accelerator or medical equipment, not a fission plant. And so we were hoping to see an adoption of that scale, and the G7 countries take leadership in setting up policies and regulations. The last meeting was the beginning of that. And since then, we've seen several of the countries in the G7 initiate commercial fusion regulation work. I've been up here in Canada 3 times in the past year, working on that with the Canadian government. The Japanese government is moving this forward. The German government's moving it forward. So we're seeing a momentum for this new technology. And I think they're taking a lens on not just fusion, but other new technologies to say, how can we harmonize? How can we allow things to move faster to adopt these new technologies? So we're hoping we'll continue to see that coming out of Canada. And then as it moves to France, that we start to see that momentum just continue to enable the new technologies to be able to come to market as quickly as possible.
Well, Lee, thank you very much. And, if I think about the meeting we had in Torino, which was a breakthrough, I agree. It was right on the heels of the Draghi report. And the Draghi report was very focused on Europe. But I think it could apply to a much broader audience at the time, certainly the US and other places. And the Draghi report was effectively, Europe has lost its competitive edge, and it's behind on energy. And even though it was intended towards Europe, I think we read it much more broadly than that. So at the Turin meeting, we were talking a lot about how do we kind of come to the reality we're not where we need to be, whether what we learned from Ukraine, the Draghi report, other growths that we were starting to see with data centers, energy security. How do we kind of solve for that? But it was a lot of talk and problem solving. I think what's different 18 months from now is like we're fully in action mode. And every day seems to move faster than the day before. I think we all feel that. And I think there's really 3 things from our perspective that's happened at GE Vernova. One is in January, President Trump issued an energy emergency declaration. And that sounds like a very US-centric answer in a G7 conference, but it's not limited to the US, just like the Draghi report, I don't think was limited to Europe. When President Trump said this is an energy emergency for the US, from my perspective, as someone who engages with all the G7 nations, the whole world, whether they issued a declaration or not, kind of responded in the same way. And what we see now is this kind of acceleration of action. Everything is strictly action focused, whether you're in Brussels or in Japan or other places. How do we move as quickly as possible? How do we solve bottlenecks and burdens to deploy energy for whatever reason we want to talk about? And every country has a little different reason for doing so. But now there's this notion we're going to do less talking and more action. I think that's one of the things that's changed in the last 18 months. The second, from our perspective, and Lee, you mentioned industrialization. Our role at GE Vernova, we help produce a third of the world's energy through all our technologies. And so we're one of the few companies in the world that has to produce the equipment so that Microsoft and others can get access to the electrons. And so we have announced $9 billion into our supply chain. In the US alone this year, we've implemented about $800 million, 2,000 new jobs on gas turbines, electrification equipment, small modular reactors, wind equipment, to kind of really grow that supply chain in the US and beyond so that we can meet this demand. We're tripling the capacity of our gas turbines alone from where we were from December to where we are today to make 3 times as many gas turbines per year in Greenville, South Carolina. We're seeing that all across the company, this industrialization of supply chain, a lot more to come. I think the third thing that's changed, and Fred, I thought your great remarks touched on this, we've moved from concepts to reality. If you go to Darlington to see the BWRX, you're going to find about 400 people, 40 miles from here. You're going to find 400 people on site today. They've dug out a 28-meter excavation. It's not in steel. It's encased in concrete. We have the steam pressure reactor encased in concrete, dug out. We're starting to go above ground now. We're building the steam pressure reactor. We're building the steam turbine. We're building the training center today. And this is not a concept. This is reality. That plant will be commissioned in 2029, producing electrons in 2030. And with the announcements in Japan and everything, I'm sure we'll have some great discussion. Canada's great. Canada's in the lead, but we're going to see this, I think, being deployed simultaneous in a lot of different places. So I think it's a theme of where we were in turn from a lot of great discussions that have set up the action that we're seeing being accelerated so quickly today.
Yeah, thank you, Roger. And I think action mode captures it really well for this panel. So maybe I can go over to you, Michelle, because Microsoft on the energy partnerships front has really been in action mode. So I'd love for you to tell us a little bit more about what you've been up to and where you see yourself in the future.
Yeah, so I'd actually like to start with the other question, because I think one important thing that has happened over the last 18 months has also been the developments around artificial intelligence. And that's where a lot of this demand starts, is that we have customers that are around the world, both in the United States, Canada, and in most other countries, who want to use more digital services and use AI to develop, to provide services for their customers. And what that requires is companies to then build data centers that require electricity to be able to provide those services. And that's what we've been focused on is our 3 roles here, which is one, as a customer and using our procurement lever to be able to help accelerate working with partners like GE Vernova and so many other utilities that are out there to bring more electricity onto the grid in the places where we operate. The second is as a investor. We have a climate innovation fund in which we are investing in very new technologies, both in the energy space and in other materials, to help really accelerate the deployment of these types of technologies. And as a solutions provider, in partnering with companies to leverage AI to be able to deliver the electricity objectives that they have. And so if you think about just the progress that we've had in the last year alone, we've contracted about 19 gigawatts of new carbon-free electricity, and that's been through some really innovative ways. One is with a new aggregation agreement with Brookfield for 10 gigawatts of renewables. The other is working with Constellation to bring the Crane Energy Center back online. That's 830 megawatts of clean power that will go back online in the PJM market, alongside the great work that Commonwealth Fusion is doing. We are also working with another fusion company, which we signed the first PPA with Helion to say that if you build it, we will be able to buy it and bring fusion online in Washington State. So just a lot of exciting work to be able to really accelerate the deployment of this electricity, but also the types of technology using a wider diverse set to be able to bring the reliability, affordability, and clean energy that we all need.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. And I think I want to talk a little bit later on the panel also around this tension that we're seeing with regards to reducing emissions. So just putting this in everyone's mind. But Grant, I want to go over to you. Obviously, big news yesterday with Westinghouse and USG. But for you specifically, because we've already talked a little bit at this forum about the deal, want to hear A, your perspective, but B, also uranium supply and the future as we're thinking about supply chains and digging deeper into making things reality.
Yeah, so maybe I'll just touch on both of those. With respect to the announcement that was made yesterday, what it reflects, this announcement that the US government is going to underwrite $80 billion worth of reactor new builds in the United States and deliver on the executive orders from May 23rd. It really recognizes that the United States didn't quite have the launch conditions that were existing in other countries. Like I walked in and I heard the other panelists say, you know, nuclear's 5 years away, and that was 10 years ago. It's a bit of a misnomer. There are 63 reactors under construction today, including the ones that Roger talked about that Nicole is building. You add in the refurbishments that have happened here in Canada. You add in the life extensions. There is a tremendous amount of nuclear going on right now. It's not tomorrow's story, it's today's story. And the jurisdictions that were launching had a package of financial, regulatory, and technology decisions that were allowing governments to imagine what it was like to build out nuclear infrastructure. And the US was struggling. I think we could all see this. The US was struggling with finding those launch conditions. So yesterday's announcement was very simply a US government that said they're going to have to take a role. That role is going to have to be in underwriting the first build, accelerate that next of a kind to nth of a kind, because the order book at nth of a kind is massive. It's just the order book at next of a kind wasn't quite as big. I think we all expect that this announcement alone is going to bring more investment opportunities and more willingness for some of the utilities that might have been a little bit reluctant to build the first two-pack are going to come into the queue now. So it really reflects that it was time for action. When you think about the fuel side, one of the messages that we always need to leave in nuclear is fuel will never be the barrier for a nuclear revival. And that's very simply because nuclear reactors run under long-term procurement. You know, the fuel buyers do not have a fuel bundle going into a reactor in the next 12 months for which they haven't already bought the uranium years ago. That's just the way it works. So what it means is, as long as demand is coming to the market and that demand is robust and it's sustainable, it sends the signal to the supply side to make the investments, to have the uranium available, the product for which there's no substitute. But then, of course, the service steps, the conversion, the enrichment, the fabrication. So as long as you are building a reactor and you're thinking of your long lead items as your reactor pressure vessel, your reactor coolant pump, and oh, by the way, your fuel will never be a barrier. If somebody decides they want to build up nuclear infrastructure and they don't think about the fuel till it's time to commission the reactor, they're just going to simply pay a lot more because they're going to be coming to a very tight front end of the market that's not designed to meet front end demand in that way. But if they think about fuel as the long lead item that it really is, it is an absolutely seamless security endeavor.
Yeah, thank you. And I think highlighting long lead items in for energy security is more and more important because governments and off-takers are really getting used to this idea that there has to be long-term off-take and long-term planning. And along these lines, I just want to, and maybe Jennifer, I'll start with you, is we haven't talked a lot about climate today, reducing emissions. So it's a little bit of an elephant in the room. Thankfully, all the technologies we're talking about are actually doing it. But I would love to kind of get your perspectives on how you expect governments to integrate energy affordability and climate, especially with this new debate going on timelines and affordability.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm glad you brought up the climate aspect. That's actually, we think about that all the time. It's the core mission of the company. It's important that we're developing a new technology that is scalable, can meet the energy demand. So how can you deploy quickly and also address climate change? Those are all part of why we do what we do every day at Commonwealth Fusion Systems. And so when we think about that scale and that deployment and what governments can do, part of it is we have to, our company has to take on the responsibility of creating a business model that works. So we're developing a product that is a grid scale fusion power plant, 400 megawatts net electric, 1 unit. You can serialize the units similar to what we do in Fission today to have a gigawatt, 2 gigawatts, whatever you need. But we're also designing it in a way that we can have the equivalent of a Tesla Gigafactory, a Hyundai shipping yard, kind of those scale of production of the materials that go into it so that we can create the components, send them on site and assemble them. So we're creating a machine that everybody gets the same machine and we can then deploy very quickly. It gets assembled on site. Because how do you get scale fast? For twofold. Energy demand's going up. We've talked about AI. We've talked about advanced manufacturing. We haven't talked much about parts of the world that would love to see their standard of living go up, have come up the economic development curve in a way that they've been held at for a very long time, but also do that in a way that we're having a positive impact on the climate. So all those things we're planning, we're looking at how we're doing that. It's the ability to deploy quickly that's going to matter for us as well. And so we think about all the things that everyone else here on stage thinks about. We think about, Michelle and I were just talking about it on the break. We think about permitting. How quickly can you actually come up with the concept? But once you have a concept, how quickly can you get those built in the ground going? And if that takes too long with the new and innovative technology that's coming out, you're kind of missing the window. And it's a real mistake. So I think there's an opportunity, I think, for governments to think about policies, regulations, permitting, all those things. How can we make it faster for new technology to deploy? Because the new technology is coming. We are on a timeline. We're going to start commissioning our fusion demonstration plant in Massachusetts next year. We're going to show that we can put 10 times more power out than in. That's the economics. Can you get $1 per kilowatt that competes with everything else? Because you're not going to be successful if you don't. So we're going to be able to demonstrate that with that machine. But we've already chosen the site for our first fusion power plant where electrons are going to go in the grid. And we're going to connect that into the grid with our partner Dominion, a utility in the United States. And we have gotten our zoning approved for that. We're doing our environmental permitting in the next few years. We'll break ground to bring that online in the early 2030s. So it's both playing their parts in this, but then the idea is how can you make it easier for companies to deploy the technology that is solving energy demand and climate change simultaneously? It's an important thing.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. And Michelle, would you like to come in on this question as well?
Absolutely. So as we're building out data center infrastructure, it's essential that we build it out in a sustainable way. Microsoft set sustainability commitments in 2020 to be carbon negative, water positive, zero waste, and to protect as much land as we use. And that continues to be our North Star as we build out our infrastructure. But what that means is that local communities are really focused on having data centers use as little water as possible. It means that they want us to operate as efficiently as possible and to use as much clean energy as possible. So in addition to the clean energy procurement as the first leg of what we do, we're really focused on how we can ensure that inside the data center, we are working and we are driving as much efficiency as possible through both how the hardware and the efficiency of how that works, but also through software. An interesting opportunity that we have is reducing the energy that we use by reducing our water consumption and how we cool. Instead of cooling the entire data center and the entire building, having direct to chip cooling, which helps reduce the electricity and the water use. And a third way that we are focused on this in our builds is looking for opportunities to scale the market for new materials, for lower carbon cement, for lower carbon steel. And so that's where really our Climate Innovation Fund has come into play. We are making investments in these early stage technologies and then matching that with our procurement and with thoughtful policy advocacy to make sure that we have that governments are able to help support in permitting, support in building out these markets by credits that help bring down the costs for some of these materials, and also in how you are able to certify those materials. And we've seen this work. We've seen this work in the carbon removal market. Early investment in technologies around the world have helped really scale the ability to take carbon from the atmosphere and to store it in lots of different ways. We've seen it work in the sustainable aviation fuel space as well. And so we're looking to now bring that to the green steel and the green cement areas.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle, for that perspective and bringing some other technologies to the conversation as well. Roger, I saw you wanted to join us.
Well, Leah, I really appreciate you asking the question because it's such an important topic to be framing in. And I'll just say briefly, as someone who's been an environmentalist for 30 years and concerned about climate change for almost as long, maybe half that time, I've never felt more optimistic in terms of being in a position where we're delivering solutions to address emissions, to address environmental, to address sustainability. We kind of try to prove that ourselves. We have a more diversified portfolio of generation technologies than some of my colleagues up here. We have nuclear, of course, we have wind, but we also have gas turbines. You've probably heard about those. And so last year we put about 37 gigawatts of capacity onto the grid. That's about the size of Virginia's grid, the data center capital of the world. We energized about 71 gigawatts of transformers. That's about the size of South Africa. And in doing so, the emissions associated with that capacity was 25%. The carbon intensity was 25% below the carbon intensity of the grid itself. We avoided about 8 million metric tons of emissions, about the size that Tesla avoids when it sells more electric vehicles. So to us, that's just a proof point that the more we're making these investments at scale for electrification, the more we're also having these benefits on climate change, on sustainability, on improving emissions at the same time. And that's what gives me so much optimism that we're able to do both. And it's why I appreciate we're having the conversation, because I think we do need to draw more attention to the mutual benefits of these investments at scale and the benefits for emissions.
Yeah, thank you, Roger. And refreshing to hear that you never felt more optimistic. Grant, would you like to join us on this conversation?
And just to echo this last comment, because I think it's a really important one. You don't have to choose between a climate security solution and an energy security solution when you're talking about baseload power like nuclear. And so it really doesn't matter what prompts the conversation. It offers a set of characteristics that appeal to those who want to secure the grid, those who want a clean grid. It checks all the boxes. It's why it's back in the policy toolbox. And I think in a more durable way than it has been in the past, when it was just simply, can you build a big asset whose only skill is it generates heat? And there's a bunch of other things that generate heat, and can you do it competitively? Well, now there's other values being attached to that calculation, and it's very favorable to nuclear.
Great. And as usual, we never have enough time for these panels, but I do want to launch into 2 lightning rounds before Minister Hodgson is joining us here for a keynote. The first one is thinking about the G7. We've heard earlier we should be looking to China to learn some key lessons, but I want to know from all of you as global affairs experts, where should the G7 be looking, or maybe to each other, to learn key lessons, and what should they be? What is the most important lesson to learn? So it's a lightning round, 1 sentence or less. You want to start? You're brave.
Sure. What we're seeing, and this isn't just a nuclear comment, but what we're seeing is that the need to collaborate and the need to coordinate is stronger than it's ever been. There is no nation in the G7, even in the broader OECD, who can go it alone. I mean, there isn't anybody in our space that can go it alone. And I mean, the Canadian story often gets told that Canada's got this totally self-contained supply chain for CANDU reactors, which isn't true, because we don't make zirconium in Canada, and that's the Achilles heel of a CANDU reactor. So we have to collaborate. But what I see is at the heart of that collaboration is good old-fashioned industrial policy, standardized designs, sequence accordingly, and simplify. Yeah, I just, we've lost, I think that tendency for countries to look at each other competitively and try to compete with each other on industrial supply. And they're looking at standardizing, sequencing, and simplifying. That's just going to benefit all of us. And that's not just in nuclear.
And that brings us all the way back to the Draghi report on competitiveness, Roger.
Well, I would certainly adopt the simplification point. I think that's been talked about today. And, it's not just China. I think if you look outside the G7, whether that's the Middle East, whether it's Southeast Asia in general, they're just getting things done. 8 months to them is a long time. In the United States, that's 8 months. You'll be lucky to have your permit submitted. And you're talking years. I know other countries some are worse and some are about the same. The simplicity, we're just so uncompetitive when it comes to that. And we've got so much to do. I think a lot of good minds on it. The other thing I would add, which also came up this morning, is just the durability of policies. If I look at these other nations in Middle East, Southeast Asia, they're planning for 10 years, and that's their North Star, and they're sticking to it. Then they're starting to plan for the next 10 years, 5 years into that, and they just drive forward. And not just the United States, a lot of these nations, they shift their policies. It makes it very hard to make these investments at scale. It creates a lot of uncertainty, and it's not good for any of this. And I'd like to think there's things here everybody can agree with: small modular reactors, nuclear reactors, and so on. But the durability of policy, I think, is probably the thing that is something for the G7 to be tackling pretty aggressively.
I would like to, add my voice to the permitting as well. I think that there's actually been some really innovative policies that have been announced across the G7 with the Trump administration and the AI Action Plan here in Canada, the UK looking at, first ready instead of first come in interconnection. So quickly seeing what works and being able to share best practices. I would like to say the second thing is skilling. We've been talking a lot today on infrastructure, but if you think of the two things that we need to be able to succeed, it's having infrastructure and people who can who have the jobs and they have the skills to be able to deliver that infrastructure and run that infrastructure and bring value to the economy. And so I think that's a huge opportunity when it comes to skilling for the G7 to work together, both in energy skills for the future, as well as particularly the AI skills that they'll need in the energy space.
And I'll wrap up quick. I know we're running out of time. I agree with the really good points made here. And it's the cooperation piece and the understanding of how to work together to advance and provide all the energy that we're all going to need. And so it's how can we deploy in other countries? How can we get supply chains going? How can we create less friction in the system for trade with the supply chains that are needed for these industries and deployment of technology not being impeded by policies that make that difficult in other countries? So I think the G7 is doing a good job at thinking about how they can cooperate and move forward with that. But I do think these things need to be happening in real time, quick, because as we've heard from other speakers, China's moving fast. China is building relationships around the world. We think about it every day with fusion technology because China is outspending everybody dramatically in fusion to own fusion. And they're already out talking. They sort of take a Belt and Road approach to how do we then become the company or the companies that go out and deploy this in the world, as opposed to US companies, Canadian companies, European companies. So I would say thinking about how to work together to remove the friction points for rapid deployment of technology is a really important piece too.
Okay, fantastic. I think we have time for one more little lightning round now where we have our audience here and our gracious host. Thank you so much. What is your message to the meeting tomorrow, but potentially even as we're thinking about France? We started this panel thinking about where we came from Italy last year. Lightning round again. Any additional thoughts? Any requests to policymakers?
I'm going to go back to a sense of urgency. Actually being able to come to the table and come up with solutions. And I think Roger pointed out earlier, we're in action mode in industry now, moving forward, and we need policy and regulation to keep up with that. And so I think it's difficult times at the moment politically, but at the end of the day, we need to find common ground and come out with action and be able to support what I'll call a rapid deployment to meet this energy demand curve that is just getting steeper by the year.
I think it's being innovative, not just in the technology and the energy, but also in the policy and making sure that we have all of the different sectors and all of the different parts of the economy that are going to both be impacted and able to bring solutions at the table.
I would just echo the urgency point. That is the most important thing. We got to move. Time is working against us, both from the planet's perspective, from the energy perspective, and from the competitive perspective. I'll be optimistic. I was a bit behind the scenes for yesterday's Japan announcement, at least as it pertained to us. And you'd probably be a little surprised and unsettled at how quickly that came together. We also had a new election in Japan a week ago.
Yeah.
But credit to Secretary Lutnick, credit to the new leaders in Japan. They did not let time work against them. They used every hour down to the minute to their advantage to get those deals done. And it was inspiring to see the pace at which they were willing to solve really hard things. So that gives me some optimism.
I'm not going to stand in the way of the minister, so I just
Okay.
echo these comments.
Well, I just want to thank you so much for this fantastic panel. Where industry is in action mode, and I think what this panel really did is bring additional layers and lenses to the conversation here today. Roger, you've never been more optimistic about climate, so that's really fantastic. We really need urgency, policy innovation, a new sense of industrial policy, collaborate and coordinate to prevent Achilles heels. That's from you, Grant. Standardize, sequence, and simplify. And then I think finally, what the biggest message is coming away is industry is ready to roll, and we need governments and policymakers to keep up with industry. And with this, thank you very much. Thank you all for joining us here. And
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it has been a full morning, and we're so thankful you're here. Part of pulling these events together is about incredible substance and incredible panels. And we've had a dynamic set of stakeholders come to speak with us today, defining energy security, thinking about the innovation ecosystem and the policies we need to make this a priority issue, noting that it is dynamic, that it is not monolithic. It's not just about oil. It's also about critical minerals. It's also about nuclear and next generation technologies like fusion. But as a convener at the Atlantic Council, and this time in partnership with NRCan, Natural Resources Canada, and the Munk School, it's also really important to have good audiences. And so thank you again for being here. It's easier to achieve that, though, when you bring it back to a really good speaker. And so we're excited to be able to culminate today with a special guest keynote remarks. Obviously, this is the G7 week, Energy Ministers Week, and Minister Tim Hodgson, Minister of Energy of Natural Resources for Canada, and host of the 2025 G7 Energy and Environment Ministers meeting here. We're really excited to have you, Mr. Minister. Welcome, and excited to hear your thoughts on how we can pioneer the future of energy security.
Thank you very much. A little deja vu watching that panel. It brought me back to the first IPO I ever did on Wall Street. Was for a little company from Saskatchewan called Cameco. The nuclear industry went through a long period of wilderness. After that, it's great to see the focus here today. So good afternoon, everyone, and bonjour. I will start with an acknowledgement, which is traditional in Canada. I'll acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat peoples, and that Toronto is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. I'd also like to acknowledge that Toronto is covered by the Treaty 13 signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaty signed with the multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. Okay, so let's start. I do not think I can overstate that we're today at a tipping point. I think we just I caught the tail end of that conversation. Countries who built the post-World War II economic order are now reordering it. We are halfway between 2000 and 2050 when we're aiming to be at net zero emissions. AI has thrown a wrench or maybe a spark into all the best laid plans and is forcing urgent choices about data governance, bias, security, and autonomy. Multilateralism is turning into mercantilism. Supply chains are targets for non-market actors to manipulate. Energy is being used for political leverage. The line between economic security, national security, and energy security is gone. In this context, this session today and tomorrow's G7 meeting cannot be another policy panel. It must be a field briefing for the free world's economies, one where we set the agenda for securing energy, mobilizing capital, and scaling technologies that provide our democracies with an advantage. That said, I firmly believe that through diplomacy, cooperation, and smart policy, we can make the most of this moment. The G7 is one incredibly powerful tool through which to do that. I know that because this moment recalls the origins of the G7. Half a century ago, an oil shock rolled through the world economy. Prices spiked, growth faltered, and inflation surged. The collapse of the Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rate led to chaos in international monetary markets. To navigate this, in November of 1975, I can remember that, I'm older than most of the people in the room, leaders of 6 industrial democracies formed a crisis cabinet, the G6. And 1 year later, Canada joined, and the G6 became the G7. The point of the G7 was not to talk about talking, as is sometimes the case at multilateral forums like these. It was for the world's leading democracies to take disciplined action, preserve stability and growth through cooperation. And it worked. In the 1970s, the G7 effectively worked to align plans, de-risk markets, keep citizens working, and making sure energy scarcity was not used to coerce our countries. That founding DNA, an alliance that moves at the speed when energy becomes a weapon, remains the G7's defining legacy. But with the times we are facing today, it must be more than a legacy. It must be renewed. Today, as I just described, we confront a new kind of energy crisis shaped by geopolitical pressures, climate change, and technological disruption. Just as the G7 once anchored the global response to oil shocks, it must now lead in shaping a new, secure, sustainable, and markets-based energy order. Energy security is the first pillar we must build in the face of this crisis. Recent events have made one truth unmistakable. Democracies cannot afford complacency or dependence on suppliers who do not share our values. At the extreme end of the spectrum, we have watched Russia weaponize energy against the Ukraine and to pressure all of Europe. That reality has reset the energy paradigm, underscoring the strategic value of sustainable, homegrown systems that preserve stability and freedom of action. Energy affordability is the second pillar we must build in the face of this crisis. In a world of volatile prices, policy must start at the kitchen table. We need to focus on delivering to our citizens lower, more predictable energy bills without sacrificing security or climate ambition. That means scaling energy efficiency and sharpening market design, accelerating clean, firm, and flexible supply, modernizing grids to cut congestion costs, and diversifying fuels and trade so no single shock sets prices. Affordability cannot be a slogan. It is a test of whether our energy system serves people, strengthens competitiveness, and sustains public consent for the energy transition. So, ladies and gentlemen, every democracy has a choice. Stand with partners to build energy sovereignty, affordability, and just livelihoods, and free and prosperous market-based economies, or drift into vulnerability to those who would reorder the world for their own ends. In a world this contested, there is no safe middle ground. That is why our government here in Canada has adopted a nation-building operating posture. As the Canadian Prime Minister has set out, and which you will see reflected in our first budget next week, we will transform how our government works. We will take more action with less bureaucratic red tape. We heard a little bit about the challenges of that a few minutes ago. We will relentlessly focus on public dollars where they are strategically invested to unlock private investment. We will balance our operating budget on a credible 3-year timeline so capital is confident and affordable. And we will significantly increase our exports by 2035 in order to generate $300 billion in new international trade to pay for the public services we are proud to deliver Canadians. In plain terms, we will move faster, waste less, and build and export the energy, the natural resources, the manufactured goods, and the agricultural products that strengthen our economy and our allies. It will not be easy, but things worth doing rarely are. And we know there are interested customers for all of this. In fact, I hear constantly from nations on the other side of both oceans that they see in Canada something they want: our resources, our energy. Our value proposition for our allies and investors is clear: rule of law, scale and diversity of resources, world-class engineering, a financial center capable of mobilizing global capital. For too long, ladies and gentlemen, we did not fully exploit that value proposition. Now there is no longer time for half measures. It's time for bold action, clear decisions, and a renewed spirit for building. That means Canada and Canadians will come together to challenge ourselves and to reframe our national conversation. No more asking, why should we build? The question is, how do we build? That means breaking down barriers and cutting through the red tape we heard about just a few minutes ago. It also means doing things responsibly the first time, meeting our duty to consult so Indigenous peoples are true partners, and protecting our environment so we don't have to clean up the mistakes later. I want to be very clear. In the new economy we are building, Canada will no longer be defined by delay. We will be defined by delivery. So what does delivery look like? It begins with a vision to build Canada into a conventional and clean energy and natural resources superpower. Being a modern energy superpower means delivering on both reliability and decarbonization. Lower emissions oil and gas, nuclear plant life extensions, and new first-in-the-world SMRs. Affordable and well-integrated renewable energy, carbon capture at scale, and end-to-end critical mineral value chains. It means both ensuring energy affordability and security at home and working with our partners and allies to supply and ensure theirs. We can do this through our exports, whether it's low carbon intensity LNG, uranium that builds secure nuclear fuel cycles, technology that enables the energy transition and builds secure grids, and critical minerals for defense and advanced manufacturing. Projects in these areas will not only inject huge capital into our economy, create new jobs for Canadians from coast to coast to coast, and unlock the real potential of our resources, but they will make our country more energy secure than we have been in decades. We know we must move quickly. This is why our government created the Major Projects Office, a single federal door for projects of national interest. Its job is to close regulatory and permitting gaps, coordinate with provinces and territories, and ensure financing plans can be achieved so bankable projects reach a timely yes. For the first set of projects that will be designated as projects of national interest, the standard is clear. Publish the critical path, hit the milestones, and be accountable for results. Ladies and gentlemen, that's how investment memos turn into construction schedules, and that's what we're going to do. For both national interest projects and building via other streams, we are focusing on a few themes, all of which feature important security, economic, and climate considerations. The first theme is strategic energy corridors. LNG where allies need it now. CCUS hubs that keep heavy industry competitive while cutting emissions. And electricity interties that harden reliability, integrate clean power, and enable provinces and territories to rely more on one another. Our second theme is our critical minerals strategy. We have referred two world-class mining projects, the Foran Mine in Saskatchewan and the Red Chris Mine in BC, to the Major Projects Office. But we are not just looking at mines. We are also looking at doing more processing, refining, and recycling in Canada to de-risk allied supply chains and capture value at home. Another key theme is next-generation nuclear, including life extension of existing plants to protect net zero emission baseload generation, and new first-of-a-kind SMRs to power communities, mines, and industries with clean baseload power. In fact, just this week, I was at the Darlington Nuclear Complex with the Prime Minister and the Premier of Ontario announcing an additional $3 billion for their SMR project, which will make Canada the first G7 country to have operational commercial SMRs. The last theme I will mention today is trade infrastructure that can get our energy goods and products to new markets. We are looking for projects that raise export throughput, and debottleneck supply chains, coordinated via our Major Projects Office with one-window permitting and Indigenous partnership frameworks. I now want to talk a little bit about support for Ukraine. I hope it's clear that leveraging our resources and jump-starting building to propel Canadian economic growth and energy security is very much top of mind and the top of our to-do list. But Canada has never been a nation that only looks inward. Ask any Canadian, they know that security, peace, and democracy for our allies is security, peace, and democracy at home too. This week, as Ukraine's energy minister joins us here in Toronto, we confront the plain fact that for Ukraine, energy security is not an abstract policy issue. It is a reality they must fight for in their theater of war. When a hostile enemy of democracy aggressively targets grids, gas storage, and transmission, they are not just striking infrastructure, they are striking the ability of free people to live ordinary and hopeful lives. But that cannot be allowed to stand. Ukraine is on the frontier of democracy. It is where energy system resilience and national survival meet. Canada stands with the Ukraine and all those fighting for energy security, and we are working to support our friends in the Ukraine. Today, I'm announcing 2 concrete steps we're taking towards this end. First, starting this year, Natural Resources Canada is supporting Ukraine's surveying, construction, engineering sectors with modernized, high-accuracy GNSS, GPS positioning. We've initiated technological transfer for NRCan's Canadian geodeck survey to Ukraine's state geocadastry, which will enable high-accuracy information even where ground stations and geodetic infrastructure has been damaged by war. This will be incredibly valuable for rebuilding critical infrastructure across energy, transport, agriculture, water management, survey, and civil engineering. Secondly, this summer, NRCan scientists traveled to Lithuania to train Ukrainian scientists on energy metering at military camps and camp energy planning tools. In energy-scarce situations, temporary military camps are often hardest hits. So energy-efficient practices and technologies can provide assurance and resilience to soldiers. Ultimately, our goal is to translate data and tech into operational advantage and victory for the Ukraine. These projects are instruments of solidarity with results you can measure: fuel saved, assets hardened, rebuilds accelerated. They will help the Ukraine win the day and help us all secure our democracies for decades. Because in the end, energy security is a team sport. As G7 president, Canada hopes to be an inspiration coach and team captain, but ultimately we're prepared to play on any position that helps our teammates. I look forward to making that very clear and offering Canada's value proposition as previously described to our allies over the next 2 days. As a great Canadian, Marshall McLuhan said, "There are no passengers on Spaceship Earth. We are all crew." In this time of urgency, everyone has a job: governments, investors, workers, innovators, allied nations, shoulder to shoulder, project to project. I hope that by the time the G7 wraps up on Friday, we will have marching orders set out for our 7 nations and allies and beyond to secure natural gas as a managed transition tool, to expand clean power, including nuclear, and to align our responsible AI and energy planning so computing growth strengthens, not strains our systems, and that we double down on our support for Ukraine's energy system. That's the agenda of this Atlantic Council Summit converted into action. So in conclusion, exactly half a century ago, the founders of the G7 turned a crisis into a plan, and a plan into coordinated, real action. They say that those who don't learn from the past are destined to repeat it. But in this case, repeating the alliance's initial success is exactly what we are striving towards. Either we act with urgency, or we accept higher risk, higher prices, and slower economic growth. For allies like the Ukraine, if we do not act with urgency, we are also accepting the end of the rules-based democratic order as we know it. Well, accepting that is something Canada will not do. Instead, we choose action, strength at home, and alignment abroad. Our word is good, our resources are vast, our workers are ready, and we will work with our allies. Let this moment of crisis catalyze a new era of strength in the form of reliable, responsible, and resilient energy and critical supply chains. So whether you are an inline operator in Windsor, a clean tech entrepreneur in Tokyo, or a young family in Kharkiv, you can plan your life with confidence in the freedom and security you deserve and the power that underpins it. Thank you very much. Merci.
Thank you so much, Minister, for that speech. People who know me know I'm a content wonk. And so I listened really carefully. And if I can make a personal remark, it is inspirational to hear that focus on urgency, which is very real. I know it is very real. And leadership at the top, that says that word over and over. It's urgent, get it done, make it happen. And we're very, very fortunate in this country to have a minister whom I know says it over and over. It's urgent, get it done. I am taking you at your word, as I think everyone else in this room is, because I do believe that it's urgent for this country and more broadly for the kind of crises that the minister talked about. And we have a very limited time frame to get it done. And I think what we owe the minister in return is a commitment to be partners, to collaborate, to make this as easy as possible, and to lend our expertise and our energy to what is really, really important. Let me also tell you that that commitment to Ukraine, particularly geospatial and the GPS assistance, absolutely critical. That is an energy infrastructure in Ukraine that has been pummeled. It's difficult for Canadians and Americans who live with what we live to understand and experience what that's like. That is a timely and really meaningful commitment that you've made, Minister, and that Canada is making to Ukraine. And it is so important. So thank you for all you're doing for us. I know the minister came to this position from private life. And I think everybody in the room would understand it's a culture shock as we move from private life to government. But we need exactly this kind of transition. We need more who are willing to make that sacrifice and that commitment. So again, thank you for doing it. I'd also like to thank Landon and NRCan, but Landon and the Atlantic Council for their partnership. I was telling Landon, we have a very well-known author, long affiliated, comes to the University of Toronto all the time. I think you all know her work, Margaret Atwood, who wrote The Handmaid's Tale. And you see her hanging out on campus. And I can't remember where this was. I know I was in the same room with her. And she made a remark that I think is worth repeating. She said, it's really stupid for Canadians to say they hate Americans. You may not like this government. And I think some of us would prefer that it weren't doing many of the things that it's doing. But there are great Americans, and there's a long-standing family relationship between Canadians and Americans. We're so pleased to have you here. I've urged Landon to come back and do more here, because the more conversations that we Canadians can continue to have with our friendly American counterparts, the better all of us will do as we make this transition through a world that is restructuring as we speak. So thank you all so much. And I'm going to hand it over to Landon now.
Janice, we've started something powerful here, and I think we're going to need to seize on it. The Atlantic Council's history starts a long time ago in a postnatal world. And it's been committed for decades to work in nonpartisan formats to be able to find partnership across administrations. And so if I could channel the opportunity that has been afforded in this partnership with the Munk School, the emotion and power of the minister's speech, we are so excited and enthusiastic to be up here, to be in Toronto for the G7, but to be committed to continuing to make change and being an aid and part of your team, Mr. Minister. On that field, you can count on the Atlantic Council and this community, I believe, to be put in and be utility players where you need us as well. Energy security for us is a transformational issue. It touches every single aspect of policy around the world. It is about economic opportunity. It is about national security. And this story is far, far from over. So thank you all for making time here during the G7 week in Toronto with our Canadian colleagues, for the companies that helped make this come to life. And let's get to work. I think we have a pretty big mandate from the minister. So thank you all. And this concludes the Future of Energy Security Summit. Thank you very much.